Fast Forward 2.
For the past 9 months, a venomous debate has raged across large swaths of the internet. Some have called it a progressive culture war against bigots. Others have called it the frontline battle against neo-Puritan, sex-negative, identity politics-obsessed zealots. Some say it's an organized harassment campaign against women, and others say it's a consumer revolt fueled by a lack of journalistic ethics in games journalism. It's been hotly debated by the opposing camps regarding which is the narrative that truly represents reality. But what is Gamergate? Actually, it's about education reform. This sounds outrageous, does it not? Well, don't take my word for it. I invite any viewer to please check out the citations given in this presentation and vet the information for yourself. In addition to the plethora of citations which will be included in the info box below, there is a massive torrent file which accompanies this presentation, which has over 40 hours of relevant videos, podcasts, interviews, PDFs, etc., which I was able to obtain through legal means. Almost all of the podcasts have already been deleted by the organization involved in an attempt to cover up their tracks. However, they were late to the party, and I had already obtained and backed up the files by the time they realized that I was onto them. So I invite everyone to download and help seed the file. And please, comb through the evidence yourself and see what I missed. With that out of the way, let's see where this rabbit hole takes us. So it's about education reform, huh? Well, maybe we should go check out the nation's leading educational research center then. The national academies, which are comprised of the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, the Institute of Medicine, and the National Research Council. Their press website, which is where they publish their papers and studies, is at nap.edu. Let's just search for games and see what pops up. Learning Science Through Computer Games and Simulations, 2011. But look at this one. The Rise of Games and High-Performance Computing for Modeling and Simulation, 2010. Let's look into this one for now. The preface says, in spring 2008, the Defense Intelligence Agency asked the National Research Council to form a committee to investigate the possible significance to national security of new modeling, simulation, and games technologies. In this report, the Committee on Modeling, Simulation, and Games assesses the current state of modeling, simulation, and games research and development worldwide. The committee also identifies ways in which these technologies could impact government and society in the future. So first of all, who exactly is this Defense Intelligence Agency that funded this report? Their website reads, at DIA, we provide military intelligence to warfighters, defense policymakers, and force planners in the Department of Defense and the intelligence community in support of U.S. military planning and operations and weapon systems acquisition. We plan, manage, and execute intelligence operations during peacetime, crisis, and war. Dang. This sounds serious. Well, let's just see what this book has to offer though. I mean, if the Defense Intelligence Agency wanted this report so bad that they were willing to fund it, it must have something interesting in it. It reads, for both game players and creators, the majority of attention to video games is oriented toward entertainment. Video game companies, many with a history of providing non-entertainment products, have often positioned themselves away from association with non-entertainment applications. There has been concern, especially in the North American market, that such association could damage their brand with core gamers or that their company could be the target of a shareholder lawsuit. Cultural attitudes toward the purpose of gaming in Japan have been different. Because personal computers are not as prevalent in Japan as they are here and in Europe, many game consoles have featured educational games and content. In Europe, also there are more games and game-like media oriented toward non-entertainment areas and simulation. Wait, let me read part of that again. Video game companies, many with the history of providing non-entertainment products, have often positioned themselves away from association with non-entertainment applications. There has been concern, especially in the North American market, that such association could damage their brand with core gamers, or that their company could be a target of a shareholder lawsuit. And for the citation here at list, private communication with an electronics arts vice president to Michael Zita, May 2005. But wait, how could these guys know what Michael Zita's personal emails were? Oh, it's because Zita was actually on the committee which authored this paper. Now it's starting to make sense, but it gets much scarier when we move on to the section titled Political Manipulation Through Games on the Internet. It says, large-scale games create a new venue for political manipulation. While some cases of direct political manipulation of an individual have been popularized by fiction such as The Manchurian Candidate, it is the manipulation of large numbers of people that can potentially be accomplished through internet media. Enabled by the internet, political messages can be quickly distributed to the world population with little validation beyond the recipient's own social filters. Games, modeling, and simulation present a new dynamic in the use of the internet as a source of propaganda. There are three main components that need to exist in order for a game to have an effect on its user base. First, the computer game should be well designed to distribute a political message, either covertly or overtly. In the former case, the game may be more likely to convert new people to an ideology. In the latter, it is more likely to target a population in order to reinforce a message or derive an action from a willing user base. The Serbian resistance and pro-democracy game, A Force More Powerful, for example, teaches the strategy of nonviolent conflict. The second requirement to make a game more effective is to adequately model the behaviors of the game's actors in order to optimize the messages being sent. Effects of this could be significant if properly orchestrated by a foreign power or commercial entity. A third challenge for game designers is to create a game that is compelling and fun to play in order to keep audiences attracted to it for a substantial enough period of time to successfully convey desired messages. But when we look up the Defense Intelligence Agency on Wikipedia for the description of the agency, it starts to make a lot more sense why they commissioned this report. It reads, "The Defense Intelligence Agency is the main foreign military espionage organization of the United States, operating under the jurisdiction of the Department of Defense." Established in 1961 under President John F. Kennedy by the Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, DIA has been at the forefront of U.S. intelligence efforts throughout the Cold War and rapidly expanded both in size and scope since the September 11th attacks. Due to the sensitive nature of its work, the spy organization has been embroiled in numerous controversies, including those related to its intelligence gathering activities, its role in enhanced interrogations, read torture, as well as attempts to expand its activities on U.S. soil. Now, according to Yuri Bezmenov, a former high-ranking KGB officer who was a master at subversion and psychological operations, he claims that 85% of military espionage is purely psychological, usually using various forms of propaganda. So now that we know that the DIA is basically the Department of Defense's psychological subversion and intelligence arm, it makes a lot more sense why they financed this report. But ignoring the chilling sentiments of knowing that the military is specifically interested in ways to indoctrinate and brainwash the public with games, which I'm sure has nothing to do with the fact that they just repealed the laws which banned using propaganda on domestic turf, read you and me, well, ignoring that, we have a guy that was on the committee to write the report, claiming that the electronics arts vice president told him in 2005 that he was scared of getting sued by shareholders if he made games which weren't aimed at being fun. So now it makes sense why there might have been a coordinated effort to kill the gamer identity. Apparently, serious games in North America can never really take off the ground while the current cultural attitudes remain in place because the major studios are scared of retribution from hardcore gamers and investors in the current climate. Well, this is all according to the expert committee hired by the national academies anyway. But why would these journalists that wrote the Gamers Are Dead articles really care if serious games actually take hold or not? Well, for one, these journalists want validation in a career that's been largely looked down upon. As the saying goes, game journalists get the same pay as a movie critic, but none of the respect. These egomaniacs surely had a vested interest to change that. But it's also not outrageous to entertain the idea that these journalists were informed of the propaganda qualities of serious games, and if that were the case, they could have seen their Gamers Are Dead articles as essentially voting in bloc as a form of political activism in order to enact change. Now, considering that I uncovered a video from 2006 where two of the Vox Media and Polygon founders gave a speech to Microsoft Research wherein they teach Microsoft the wonders of internet propaganda, it's not hard to believe that these guys might have been useful idiots who believed that they were just being good little radical leftists. However, I wouldn't give Chris Plante, who was a co-founder of Polygon, a pass.
Welcome to the Visiting Speaker Series. I'm so glad you could all join us this afternoon for the amazing talk by the amazing bloggers Jerome Armstrong and Marcos Zuniga, who write the Daily Kos and Jerome's fabulous blog, which is called
Mighty D.
Mighty D. They've done some really interesting work and some really interesting thinking around how do the new grassroots within our political structure in the United States work? Do these new technologies actually create a space where different types of people are having a new political voice? Do these types of structures help people actually get together and become a true force politically?
In terms of where Marcos and I came into this whole new phenomenon, and I think we can look at the internet as an opening to many more voices than were present, was within the political arena. Following the 2000 election, both of us got involved in politics, sort of ramping up, but we both became, there was a vacuum out there in terms of partisan voices on the Democratic side, and voices in general that were authentic and that reflected politics from the point of view of ordinary people instead of from the point of view of either journalists that were covering politics from their particular standpoint for years on end, or from politicians and parties that had become ossified and sort of used to a certain way of the media presenting their elections and campaigns. And so we stepped into that vacuum and quickly found that there was a lot of people out all across the nation that were interested in hearing an authentic voice, but not only that, they were interested in participating by commenting not only with us, but with other people in the blogs in this new way of political dialogue. And from there, it's grown to where we were involved with the Howard Dean campaign, and the blogs have grown tenfold since then, to where now Marcos' blog, Daily Kos, gets over 500,000 visitors a day. And so we set out to travel all around the country. We went to 20 different states, interviewed 160 people, and what we started out originally with as an idea was that the Democratic Party lacked a brand, but we quickly went much deeper than that. And what we really found out was there were structural problems with how the Democratic Party was operating at the campaign and election level in terms of organizing. And those are the things that we wrote about in the book. And our voices, given the amount that the audience has increased, has allowed us to sort of become gatecrashers into the system that is ossified within the Democratic Party, and hopefully bring about a change there. So I'll let Marcos speak now. So
yeah,
we'll just go back and forth. We're kind of
no, thanks for coming. And you know, I actually wanted to be a programmer when I grew up, but I wasn't good at it. So it's always been my shame that I couldn't do what you guys are doing. I like to say that I don't consider myself a leader. What I do consider myself is somebody who's creating the infrastructure and the machinery to allow leaders to emerge and allow those leaders to be supported, and in a way that was not possible just a few short years ago. And so we as a movement, progressive movement, have been losing a lot of this talent, a lot of the best and brightest in our movement. Conservatives, on the other hand, have been very, very effective at nurturing that talent and pulling it into their system. So rather than losing, what they're doing is they're actually out there recruiting from corporate America, pulling them into their movement, and they pay them well, and they nurture them, and they mentor them. And so what you have is a machine that is extremely up-to-date, technologically super advanced, Democratic Party has failed to communicate with their supporters and with people who are persuadable in just about 80% of the country, huge swaths of the country. Republicans are in every single district. They're communicating everywhere. And that is a very dramatic change. And what enables them to do that is technology. I mean, there was no way to do that before the internet, before this revolution that you guys are a part of, and we're now kind of riding that wave. That did not exist before. Now they've been able to adapt to that and move quickly in that regard. Our side is back in the Stone Age, right? And so, for us, it's kind of, in a lot of ways, it's frustrating to see that they have embraced their innovators and their entrepreneurs, and we have to actually beat them over the head, and we have to actually beat them over the head with whether it's blogging or whether it's just blog. We have to beat them over the head for them to realize that they need to start changing the way they're doing business and adapt to the changing political and media and technological landscapes.
And they didn't want to change. We both worked on Howard Dean's campaign, and after the election, sort of our initial impulse was to bring about change inside the structure of the Democratic Party as an organization. So we're both at the forefront of pushing for Howard Dean's movement into the DNC. And that really gets to the heart of what we talk about with people-powered politics, which is people at the very local level becoming engaged in political participation. And in many ways, it's the technology that allows that to happen. Yeah, that it's ossified, it's insular, and it's hard to break through that. And we basically made a statement that, look, if you guys you don't go along with this, then we're on the outside. We'll break in by ousting you out of the party itself. That, look, if you guys you don't go along with this, then we're on the outside. We'll break in by ousting you out of the party itself at the very precinct level. So there's been participation within the Democratic Party in terms of opening some of that up, but obviously Howard Dean was just one step in. There's a lot more work to be done.
Yeah, and Howard Dean's at the top, so we have to break through the state parties and down to the county level. And like Jerome says, you can't find information on how to take over your local party because it's on purpose. They don't want challengers, and they'd rather lose and carry their fancy little title because it makes them feel like big shit, rather than actually have to work and do their jobs, which is to actually create more Democrats and start winning some elections. And again, to us, it's all about technology. I mean, we don't need to march on the streets. As far as I'm concerned, marching in the streets is, useless. It's an old story. Nobody cares anymore. A bunch of people in the street. You think, don't they have something better to do with their time than to march in the street over some stupid thing? But a bunch of people get online and they exert pressure online. To me, that seems to be more impressive. Because a lot of times, it's not one or the other. A lot of times, you create these narratives. A lot of times, you create these narratives. Like the Cindy Sheehan story. So one of the things that the blogs were able to do is really create the buzz that allowed some of this media to have a hook to go down. So, technology. We're a media-saturated world now. Media's the future. Now with convergence, television, and the internet, I mean, it's going to be absolutely dramatic. So we're going from 500 channels to unlimited, to the entire internet on a television. So how are we as a movement going to take advantage of this? Are we going to let the Republicans once again take the lead and dominate that? And if you're a Republican, I'm sure there's some of you in here, that's what you're hoping. Right? You're hoping more of the same. And, for us, though, we're saying, we have the talent. I mean, Silicon Valley and up here and, New York, Silicon Valley, and all these tech centers are very heavily progressive, very heavily democratic. It's a crowd that maybe hasn't been as political in recent years, but that's been changing quite a bit lately. So why don't we harness that energy and that expertise and that power to build this next generation movement that will not only dominate and take over the Democratic Party, we lose on infrastructure. So unless we turn that around, and it's going to be people like you guys, really. I mean, when we look at a lot of the advocacy stuff that has been very effective the last couple of years, a lot of it is a bunch of, a database guy getting together with maybe a Perl programmer or a C++ and a designer, and they put together some kind of advocacy site. So it's that sort of thing. It's getting people who know the chops, who know how to operate in this new world, this brave new world of technology and media, and getting involved in doing change, because it happens, and it's for people like you guys, and for us too. I mean, it's not as hard as it was once upon a time to get 1 million people to march on the mall in D.C. So to me, that's pretty exciting. It's a democratizing of activism. And it's a very tangible way to start trying to push the Democratic Party and the nation closer to where it really should be, as opposed to where it's at today.
So as we've just witnessed, the two Polygon founders just admitted that they're involved with blogs with the sole intent of pushing a narrative that helps indoctrinate people into becoming voting Democrats. And that's their true goal with all their media enterprises, is to create more Democrats through propaganda. And we know that Polygon has been pushing an extremely biased feminist agenda. So it all makes sense. But let's get back to these gamers are dead journalists. The 12 journalists who basically kicked Gamergate off by writing these articles which were meant to tell the industry that the core gamer demographic simply didn't matter anymore. So with that said, could there have been someone that was pulling the strings? Someone that tricked other people into doing their dirty work and pushing an agenda that's far more sinister? Like maybe an agenda involving billions of dollars in corporate and financial interests involved? I don't know. That sounds like a tinfoil hat conspiracy. I mean, it doesn't seem very likely that a corporation would try to influence the public in any way when there's billions, possibly trillions of dollars in future profits to be made, but I guess we could entertain the idea. So, if a conspiracy was involved, what connections would there be? Wait, wasn't this paper, which distinctly detailed why the gamer identity had to be killed, authored by a committee at the National Academies? Where have I heard that before? I remember now. The creator of the game journal ProList, Kyle Orland. Well, his father was a director of the Center for Education at the National Research Council, which is one of the arms of the National Academies. He had been a director there just 3 years prior to the report, but I know what you're thinking. That doesn't mean that Mr. Martin Orland was still in close contact with the National Academies. I mean, he probably didn't even read the report, right? Well, considering that Orland gave a keynote speech at the National Academies convention in December 2014, 4 years after the report was authored, it's pretty safe to say that Orland has been in close contact with them the whole time. Not to mention, Orland still lives in the same city as the academies, and also, he's a senior program director for evaluation and policy research at WestEd, as well as the director of the Mid-Atlantic Comprehensive Center for the U.S. Department of Education. Wait, so he's the guy that's actually in charge of policy research for WestEd? Someone that's in charge of policy research would surely have read the report on games, especially considering WestEd has their own division focused on gamification, and WestEd has worked directly with the National Academies on gamified educational issues. See, WestEd is widely known for being a massive promoter of Common Core. It seems to be their solution for everything, and they shill Common Core wherever they go. Even in an hour-long presentation to Univision to try and convince Hispanics that it's going to be great for them. According to them, Common Core is great for special ed, and Common Core is just great all around, but who's the biggest promoter of Common Core in the whole wide world? Why, Bill Gates, of course. And it turns out that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation gave a $3.45 million grant to Mr. Orland's WestEd nonprofit the day before the Gamers Are Dead articles dropped. And in what seems to be an even stranger coincidence, Kyle Orland, the creator of the games journal ProList, which essentially turned the burgers and fries controversy into Gamergate proper, actually has someone living in his home that has even more direct ties to Microsoft. Turns out, someone was dumb enough to actually marry Kyle. Her name is Michelle Mazurek. Aw, don't they look like an awfully cute couple? Turns out, she was a senior consultant with Booz Allen Hamilton, which is a major tech firm. But I was able to obtain a copy of her resume, and apparently, she was only a senior analyst there up until 2008. But what's really interesting is that in 2010, she was an intern at Microsoft Research, which coincidentally was the same year that Kyle Orland started the games journal ProList, and also the same year that the National Academies report was released. And for those who harbor any doubt that Michelle and Kyle were still married in 2010 when she was an intern at Microsoft Research, well, we have a tweet from 2012 which confirms that they were. Microsoft Research. Microsoft Research. Where do I remember hearing Microsoft Research before? That's right. From the video in 2007 where Microsoft Research flew an expert from the national academies across the country to come give them a speech about how the gamification of education was absolutely vital to national security. And one of the guys that asked a question at the end of her video, Ben Sawyer, who gave a presentation on serious games the very next day, was actually one of the co-authors that was on the committee to write the 2010 paper, which says that the North American perception of games needs to change before major studios can venture into making serious games. And the lady who gave that presentation herself was actually one of the authors of the 2011 paper at the National Academies. So, maybe this is why Michelle Mazurek already deleted her resume after I posted a link to it on 8chan. But here's an archive of the Google search of her resume PDF, proving that it does indeed show that she interned at Microsoft Research in 2010, and I didn't alter the PDF file myself. Plus, we have the academic papers she wrote for Microsoft Research while she was interned there. Also, I found proof that the National Academies were deeply studying gamified education, even when Martin Orland was the director of behavioral sciences there. You could be rest assured that he was aware of all the game research and was also in contact with Microsoft Research at the time. Well, Microsoft External Research, to be specific. You see, that's actually the purpose of Microsoft Research. Here's what MS Research has to say about itself. Microsoft Research believes that collaboration between the public and private sectors, combined with the power of computing, can help researchers as they work to solve most of the urgent challenges in medicine, environmental science, engineering, education, and many other fields. That worldwide collaborative research is driven by Microsoft External Research, an arm of the larger Microsoft Research organization, and it is designed to complement and augment the work pursued by Microsoft Corporation's more than 800 researchers, in partnership with distinguished scientists, researchers, academics, and educators. Microsoft External Research is building technologies and services that have the potential to strengthen and accelerate advances in important areas of research. Microsoft External Research supports long-term initiatives to enhance teaching and learning through the creative use of technologies such as robotics, tablet PCs, collaborative technologies, and gaming development in the curriculum to illustrate core concepts and principles of computer science. Now, we know that the 2010 Academies report came out the same year that Kyle's wife was an intern at Microsoft Research, but Orland had been hyped about the Microsoft-backed Serious Games initiative since 2006, when he wrote a lengthy article about it for The Escapist when he attended the Serious Games Summit. And in a strange coincidence, Leigh Alexander, which was one of the authors of the original Gamers Are Dead articles, who wrote perhaps the most prolific scribe of the bunch, was also wooed by Microsoft's Serious Games initiative. Actually, her very first Game of Sutra featured article was about a Microsoft event in 2007, and her rallying call was about how serious games are taking over and are gonna change the world. But back to the subject of Martin Orland and his relationship with Microsoft. Being a director of the research division at WestEd, which is perhaps the most influential educational think tank in the country, and being a top dog in education himself, you can guarantee that Microsoft was in direct contact with Orland all along. This becomes doubly apparent when you realize that when he left his position at the National Academies in 2007 to move to be the Senior Program Director for Evaluation and Policy Research, right when he joined WestEd is when they started to rake in the Gates Foundation dosh in the form of grants. They've received around $6.5 million in grants over the decade, including the $3.45 million grant they received on the day before they killed gamers, which was a bigger grant than all the other ones combined, mind you. But just as I was writing this script, another brand new WestEd grant popped up on the Gates Foundation site, another $3.5 million grant in April, and this time the grant is specifically to promote Common Core. That's $7 million in grants from the Gates Foundation this year alone. You could say that WestEd is Bill Gates' first and foremost educational think tank and Common Core promoter. And what's more, the Academy's report from 2011, which explained why they had to kill gamers, says specifically that most of the funding for gaming educational research comes from the MacArthur Foundation. Actually, Microsoft is a major funder for these projects as well, but they weren't mentioned because the national academies didn't want to seem too obvious. But let's focus on this MacArthur Foundation, shall we? I wonder if feminist frequency has anything to do with them. Well, let's find out. On Mimi Ito's blog, who is the head of the Digital Media and Learning Division at MacArthur Research, describes Jonathan McIntosh as our media curator for a 2010 event. Now we could see Jonathan describing this on his own blog as well, but we don't have actual footage of this event itself. However, we do have footage of a similar event which was held in 2013, where Jonathan McIntosh was again the media curator for the MacArthur Foundation.
We have today some pretty amazing speakers, and I do want to highlight that all of these speakers in their own way have crossed our path through the Media Activism and Participatory Politics project that Henry runs at USC. Some of them are activists, some of them work with youth, some of them are academics. They'll speak about what they do, and many of them cross between these different spheres. Next up, as you're probably guessing, since we're sitting in order, is Jonathan. So I'll let you take it away.
Hi, my name is Jonathan McIntosh. I am a remix video artist. Sometimes I use other terms to try to describe that, because I don't just put different pieces of media together to create something new, but actually try to get at building alternative narratives. And sometimes I call that transformative storytelling. So taking something that exists in pop culture and then adding or subtracting, changing the story in some way.
So next up, we have Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lissa Soap, and I'm here actually in two capacities. So primarily, I think, for this conversation, I am a producer at Youth Radio in Oakland, California, and that's what I'll be concentrating on in our conversation here. But I'm also a member with Henry and Sangeeta of that Youth and Participatory Politics Research Network that the MacArthur Foundation has put together to bring together a collaborative of researchers and practitioners who are interested in understanding the very kinds of activities that are being represented on this panel and have already been discussed, and a lot of the work that I'm sure many of you are associated with, which really shine a light on how young people are using digital, social media, and other contexts to express voice and agency in public spheres.
Now, we even found photo evidence of one of the originators of Connected Learning, who's highly affiliated with MacArthur Foundation, saying that McIntosh took a photo of him in 2007. So, obviously, Jonathan McIntosh has been hanging out with the MacArthur Foundation crowd for quite a long time. This is made clear by his tweet history with Mimi Ito, where she's talking about him and where he's retweeting her as far back as 2009. And here we have a woman named Dana Boyd mentioning McIntosh in some other tweets. Dana Boyd is a principal researcher for Microsoft Research. So let's take a look at Mimi Ito's bio to see if we can ascertain some more information. It says, Mizuko Ito is a cultural anthropologist of technology use, examining children and youth's changing relationships to media and communications, and is professor in residence and MacArthur Foundation Chair in Digital Media and Learning at the University of California, Irvine, with appointments in the University of California Humanities Research Institute in Department of Anthropology and the Department of Informatics. Her work on educational software appears in Engineering Play, A Cultural History of Children's Software. In Japan, her research had focused on mobile and portable technologies, and she co-edited a book on that topic called Personal, Portable, Pedestrian, and Mobile Phones in Japanese Life. She has led a 3-year collaborative ethnographic study funded by the MacArthur Foundation, examining youth new media practices in the U.S. and focusing on gaming, digital media production, and internet use. The findings of this project are reported in the book Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out, Youth Living and Learning with New Media. Most recently, she's co-edited and contributed to a book on fan culture, Fandom Unbound, Otaku Culture in a Connected World. Continuing work on informational learning with new media with the support of the MacArthur Foundation, she is the research director of the Digital Media and Learning Hub at UC Irvine and the chair of MacArthur Research Network on Connected Learning. In addition to her current work funded by the MacArthur Foundation, she has been awarded grants by the National Science Foundation, the Spencer Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, Intel Research, the Abe Fellowship Program, and the Japan Society for Promotion of Science, and is the recipient of the Jan Hawkins Award for early career contributions to humanistic research in scholarship and learning technologies from the American Educational Research Association. You might have noticed that she works for Intel Research. It's quite the coincidence that Intel recently decided to partner financially with Feminist Frequency, isn't it? But let's continue. Her resume mentioned that she is the research director for the MacArthur Connected Learning Research Network, which is part of the Connected Learning Alliance. And on the CLA, she serves as its chair. She is the head of the Leveling Up project for the Connected Learning Research Network, among others. But maybe if we study some of her academic papers, we can glean some insight into her beliefs and motivations. Remember, at the start of this thing, I mentioned that the National Academies had a 2011 report on gamification in education, not the 2010 report which was commissioned by the Defense Intelligence Agency because of their interest in uses of serious games for propaganda, but a 2011 report titled Learning Science Through Computer Games and Simulations, which was actually commissioned by the academies themselves. Well, it turns out the report was written for the division of the National Academies which Martin Orland used to be in charge of. It was the Division of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Education, which is part of the National Research Council. For this report, Mimi Ito was commissioned, paid, to write a response to a paper by Kurt Squire and Nathan Patterson, which was also commissioned for the report, which was titled Games and Simulation in Informal Science Education. Now, Mimi Ito's own paper was titled Socio-Cultural Context of Game-Based Learning, Games and Simulations in Informal Science Education. And as a part of what she was paid by the commission to do, she also traveled to Washington, D.C. to present her findings to the committee, and they held a workshop which was apparently open to the public. She speaks of it in a blog post here. It reads, October 2nd, 2009. Next week, I will be presenting a response paper for the National Academy of Sciences Committee on Learning Science, Computer Games, Simulations, and Education. They are convening a workshop open to the public on games for science education. It should be an interesting meeting for games and learning folks in the DC area. I am presenting a paper in response to Kurt Squire's look at science games and simulations in informal learning environments. Now, here's one of the instances in that 2011 report where it cites Ito's paper. States, Ito observes that gaming is predominantly a social and recreational activity and that any effort to introduce games designed for learning must consider the informal contexts that structure gameplay. As discussed below, these contexts influence children's and adolescents' access to games, the extent to which they play them, and the potential of games to support science learning. Although siblings and parents sometimes play together, they also compete for access to home entertainment resources, and most parents have established various rules and limits surrounding gameplay. Generally, both parents and children view gaming as an activity in opposition to academic learning. Such views, as well as the family's ability to pay for gaming technology and game titles, could constrain the potential of games to support shared learning within the family. But now let us examine Mimi's paper itself, which can be found on her blog, or in the PDF form from the National Academy's site. It states, Commercial and Public Media Culture. The context of the commercial gaming industry is also an important factor in considering social and recreational gaming, and one that is often overlooked in more educationally minded efforts. An intervention into the social and recreational space will have to compete with the commercial production and marketing for kids' attentions. History has demonstrated the challenges of inserting learning software and educational agendas into practices already saturated with commercial media culture. While independent educational and civic games have been a marginal but persistent feature of the commercial games landscape, we have yet to witness the emergence of a robust alternative market for public interest games that are comparable to public media in television or radio. These existing contexts of social and recreational gaming powerfully determine the potential and promise of alternative and new forms of gaming practice. Just as the classroom culture and educational accountabilities structure gaming and formal educational environments, the informal space is also saturated with structuring institutions, but of a more varied nature. In order to understand the opportunity space for informal science learning through games, educators and game designers must first come to grips with the fact that existing social and recreational gaming contexts operate largely in opposition to academic cultural domains and practice, including science. At the same time, the high degree of technical expertise and systematic thinking required of contemporary digital practices, as well as the opportunities for peer-based learning and collaboration in online networks, create new openings for scientific learning. In particular, we have found that the contemporary social and recreational media environment is ripe for opportunities for self-directed, customized, and interest-driven learning that, in some instances, mesh with science-oriented learning. Notice that every time Mimi references herself from 2009, Mimi is referencing her own book titled Engineering Play, A Cultural History of Children's Software. And whenever she references Ito et al., or Ito and Batante, or someone else from 2009, Ito is referencing a book commissioned by the MacArthur Foundation titled Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out, which was co-authored by Microsoft Research Principal Researcher Dana Boyd. Now, we'll cover the relationship between Mimi and Dana shortly, but for now I'll leave it be saying that Dana claims she obtained her PhD under the guidance of Mimi. But let's just focus on the text. Allow me to repeat some of what I just read so that we can critique it. In order to understand the opportunity space for informal science learning through games, educators and game designers must first come to grips with the fact that existing social and recreational gaming contexts operate largely in opposition to academic cultural domains and practice, including science. Here, she is explicitly stating that the way gaming is currently perceived by society directly affects the way in which society is able to adopt gaming as a form of education. She says the current gaming market stands firmly in the way of what she deems as educational progress. The 2011 Academy's report references her response 6 times, but it also references a book she wrote 7 times. Now remember, I just mentioned this book. It was co-authored by Dana Boyd, among others, who is the Microsoft Research Principal Researcher. Dana Boyd also co-authored another book with Mimi Ito in 2009, which was commissioned by the MacArthur Digital Media and Learning Division, which, as we stated, Jonathan McIntosh works for. The title of that book is Living and Learning with New Media, Summary of Findings from the Digital Youth Project, and it just so happens that Mimi Ito and Dana Boyd are working on a new book together, which is due out in November 2015, which is to be titled Participatory Culture in a Networked Era, a conversation on youth, learning, commerce, and politics. I bet that's going to be interesting. So this all gets rather confusing because Mimi Ito wrote 2 books with Dana Boyd in 2009, plus her response, which was commissioned by the National Academy. So I'll do my best to keep all these different publications as untangled as possible in my analysis that follows. So first, let's cover the book, which was cited 7 times in the paper. You might be surprised that some of the things McIntosh's boss, mentor, and friend writes about gaming. The book is titled Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out. In the introduction, it states, "This book series is founded upon the working hypothesis that those immersed in new digital tools and networks are engaged in an unprecedented exploration of language, games, social interactions, problem solving, and self-directed activity that leads to diverse forms of learning. These diverse forms of learning are reflected in expressions of identity, how individuals express independence and creativity, and in their ability to learn, exercise judgment, and think systematically." Now, here is a very interesting excerpt written by John McIntosh's boss herself. In the past 2 decades, as electronic gaming has gradually become established as one of the dominant forms of entertainment of our time, there has been a widespread debate over the merits of the medium. Some have accused games of promoting violence and sexism, despite very little empirical evidence that games lead to antisocial or violent behavior. Popular perception persists in painting a picture of the aggressive, isolated, compulsive gamer. Looks like Feminist Frequency's whole narrative just got blown apart by Macintosh's own boss, who is considered the field's top expert on games research, even by Macintosh himself. But how do we know that Macintosh supports her analysis and has read her book? Well, because we can see Jonathan Macintosh tweeting in support of an interview Mimi Ito did for a 2011 Wired magazine article. Now, there's a video in that article as well, so let's watch that.
So my question is this: why do we assume that kids socializing and play is not a site of learning? And on the flip side, why do we assume that schools can't have a spirit of entertainment and play as part of what they're doing? Last year I wrapped up a 3-year study with a large team of researchers where we were looking at a lot of different examples of kids' new media practice, ranging from sort of everyday hanging out behavior on sites like MySpace and Facebook with text messaging, IM, to what we were calling more geeked out kinds of participation, like making YouTube videos, creating podcasts, engaging in fan fiction, and other forms of fan production. I think the piece that we don't currently have real awareness that is shared or broad-based about is how we support kids' engagement in the more messing around and geeking out space. And this is the space that really has the opportunity to foster kids' intellectual development, their civic engagement, their personal development in really important ways, and yet we haven't really worked as educators or parents to proactively engage kids. We know that the learning outside of school matters tremendously for the learning in school. So a lot of what we're trying to say about kids' informal learning with new media is part of an already existing set of understandings that educators have of the importance of the home environment, for the peer environment, for the community, for learning that happens in schools. The question is, how can we be more active about linking those two together? And I think this is a tremendous challenge that a lot of these experimental efforts are dealing with. I think for teachers and schools and classroom learning, there's still an incredibly important role to play, which is about giving kids access across the board to a baseline set of standards, literacies, expectations about what they need to participate in contemporary society, to be reflective, and to also take opportunity of the fact that you really have kids and adults in a shared space that's safe, that's sanctioned, that gives kids an opportunity to reflect on things in their everyday life. That's not just about them being immersed in it all the time. So I think that there are incredibly important functions for schools. What we're saying by valuing informal learning is not that we should abandon formal learning, but that we should get those working together in a much more coordinated way.
How else do we know that Macintosh gives his full support to Mimi Ito's analysis of her research? Why? Because Mimi Ito is the chair of the Connected Learning Alliance. And guess who else is a member there? Hey, so let's watch a clip of Jonathan Macintosh speaking at a webinar for the Connected Learning Alliance in only 2014.
So good morning and welcome everyone to Connected Learning TV. In the final webinar in a month-long series we're calling Storytelling in Digital Age Civics. Throughout January, we have been chatting with a great group of youth activists on why and how the process of storytelling enhances their civic engagement efforts. Before we get started, I'm just going to turn it over briefly to Lisa Soap, who will be my co-facilitator today.
I work as a senior producer and run our innovation lab, but I'm also the bridge to the other invisible team that's been really important in forming and leading this webinar series, and that's our friends over at USC. So I work with Sangeeta and Henry and others as part of the Youth and Participatory Politics Research Network.
First, we have Jonathan Macintosh. He's a pop culture hacker and transformative storyteller. He has been remixing mass media narratives for critical purposes since the invention of YouTube.
So, I've been involved in a whole bunch of grassroots activist-style campaigns for the past really 10 or 11 years. But I thought I would talk about one that's more based on the battle of the story in the media. So this is something that I did pretty much on my own to see what impact and what influence I could have on changing a popular story, or a story that was happening in the popular culture. To echo some of the things that were already said, the media is lazy. I think that's something that we need to remember as people who are interested in social change. They're extremely lazy, the mainstream media. And so what it was that I wrote under my video or on my blog or whatever, that little blurb was reprinted over and over and over, and reposted over and over and over again, right? So, taking care to frame something in a careful and intentional way, right, is extremely important, because it's going to be the thing that is reprinted and reprinted and reposted and reposted. What were people saying about this film, about these topics, and then how do you say, okay, well, this is what people are saying. How do I flip that and change that and make that story what I want to say?
Jonathan, something that you just said connects to one of the questions that's come in through the live stream, that anticipation of possible critiques and feeding that into the story that you tell, so you almost preempt the kind of blowback that you could get.
But let's get back to this book, which we now know that McIntosh fully endorses, which was written by his mentor, boss, and friend. Remember, Mimi Ito just stated that gaming does not cause antisocial behavior like sexism or violence, and I quote, "Some have accused games of promoting violence or sexism, despite very little empirical evidence that games lead to antisocial or violent behavior. Popular perception persists in painting a picture of the aggressive, isolated, and compulsive gamer." Well, I do appreciate your alliteration there, Ito. But then she goes on to say that even though gaming doesn't cause sexism, quote, "Unlike the image of the violent gamer, sexism in games does have some grounding in everyday practice, although in the past 5 years the increase has been tremendous in the number of girls and women who game. Most of those gains have been made in the area of casual games and online and handheld platforms, and the more hardcore and technically sophisticated forms of gaming and game modding are still dominated by boys and men. In contrast to these concerns, researchers have been arguing that games have important learning properties that can be mobilized for education. Research in this vein was a central part of the early games industry, and it resulted in the development of a genre of game software that came to be known as edutainment in the 80s and 90s. More recently, educational researchers have engaged with simulation and other state-of-the-art games to argue that games provide important opportunities for learning and practice. Gaming practices are extremely diverse in nature and form. Gameplay is a complex and multi-layered phenomenon. We would like to suggest a possible framework for examining gaming as it is embedded in practice in relation to what we have learned about other contexts of new media engagement that youth navigate. In this chapter, we draw from a wide range of different case studies, including Batante's Laws and Cody's, Judd Anton, Dan Perkle, and Christo Sims' Social Dynamics of Media Production, and Dana Boyd's Teen Sociality in Networked Publics, Heather Horst's Silicon Family Valley study, Horst and Laura Robinson's Neopet study, Mizuko Ito's anime fan study, and Patricia Lang's YouTube and video bloggers work.
This is interesting. Well, I don't have any direct evidence that Patricia and Jonathan McIntosh worked directly together in the past. They both work on the same sort of things, and they're both mentioned in some of the same papers, and it goes to show how integral YouTube remixing is to the MacArthur Foundation. But to see how embedded McIntosh is in the educational community, we can see a blog by an associate professor at Sonoma State University in the Curriculum Studies and Secondary Education Department in the School of Education titled Teaching Tech-Savvy Kids. Now, she links to both
Patricia and McIntosh's work as educational researchers for teachers. And in her 2010 book, by the same name as her blog, she also specifically names McIntosh in relation to his YouTube remix video about Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Yes, Jonathan McIntosh has been directly involved in educational reform since at least 2010. But let's get back to the 2009 book by Mimi Ito and Dana Boyd, Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out, Youth Living and Learning with New Media. We start our discussion with a framing of the debates around gaming and learning, suggesting how a practice and youth-centered approach can inform this conversation. The body of this chapter is organized in terms of genres of gaming practice: killing time, hanging out, recreational gaming, mobilizing and organizing, and augmented gaming. We conclude our discussion with an analysis of the broader structural and cultural conditions of gaming that shape how the different genres of practice relate to one another, and the ways in which individuals gain access to or are excluded from various gameplay experiences. It continues in the section called Conceptual Framework, Gaming in Context. It states, the dominant approach to studies of gaming and learning focus on the relationship between the gamer and the text. This holds on both sides of the aisle. Just as detractors assume that the violent content of the game encourages violent behaviors, proponents of games and learning generally assume that learning follows from a good game design. You hear that, guys? Feminist Frequency knows darn well that games don't cause people to be violent. And when she said games don't cause you to be antisocial either, that means that games don't cause you to be sexist. The book continues. Although there has been a considerable amount written on games and young people's use of them, there has been very little done to establish an overall ecology of gaming, game design, and play, in the sense of how all these various elements, from code to rhetoric to social practices and aesthetics, cohabit and populate the game world. The language of the media is replete with references to the devil and heavy metal when it comes to the ill-found virtues of video games. Well, a growing movement in K-12 education casts them as the holy grail in an uphill battle to keep kids learning. While many credit gameplay with fostering new forms of social organization, alternative ways of thinking and interacting, more work needs to be done to simulate these forms of learning within a dynamic media ecology that has the participatory and social nature of gaming at its core. So even though Ito admits that violent games don't cause antisocial behavior, she says that the gaming media ecosystems needs to be uprooted to allow for serious games to become the core demographic. I wonder where McIntosh got the idea to repurpose Feminist Frequency to focus solely on gaming. It continues, gaming occupies a complicated position in relation to structures of age, class, and gender because of its status as a technically driven recreational activity usually associated with lowbrow, male-dominated identity and practice. The moral panics over games rotting the hearts and minds of children share many of the familiar concerns voiced about television. Games are frequently linked to the corrupting bad screens of television and working class culture, rather than the good screens of computers and middle class culture. Further, much like earlier forms of youth-centered popular culture, video games are a site of moral panics where intergenerational anxieties are projected onto new media. The technical sophistication of games, both as text and practices, however, throws a unique twist into these existing cultural conflicts. Well, those who see gaming as an avenue into certain forms of technical expertise and learning have argued that educators and designers should work to make games attractive to girls, and that others have argued that gaming reproduces sexist and consumerist logics that are often of dubious value. Did you hear that? McIntosh's employer and mentor expressly states those in a moral panic about video games are misguided. Well, some of us always assumed that social justice warriors weren't quite as dumb as they acted, but we can now see that the choice of Feminist Frequency to pretend to be morally outraged by video games had an exact and calculated purpose. Now, I'm going to quote the last sentence again so we could pick it apart to see exactly why Feminist Frequency started their subversive psychological operation at the behest of the MacArthur Foundation and Microsoft Research. While those who see gaming as an avenue into certain forms of technical expertise and learning have argued that educators and designers should work to make games more attractive to girls, others have argued that gaming reproduces sexist and consumerist logics that are often of dubious values for youth. So, Mimi already stated that the moral panic sentiment regarding video games was diluted, which discredits the last part of the statement. So, we'll focus on the first half. Mimi herself is one of those who claims that gaming is an avenue into certain forms of technical expertise and learning. How do we know this? Well, it's the entire premise of the book. So, in essence, she is speaking for herself when she states that educators and designers should work to make gaming more attractive to girls. It's quite the coincidence that Jonathan McIntosh, her employee, decides to use feminist frequency to do that exact thing. Like I've said, the reality is that feminist frequency is nothing but a psychological operation that was meant to alter the gaming ecosystem in a way that makes gaming more appealing to girls and women. So the real purpose of feminist frequency was not to convince all hardcore gamers that they need to hang up their Halo and go play Gone Home, but it was to set themselves up as industry consultants. They wanted to hold the keys to the industry. They wanted to have power over developers to be able to tell them what content they can and can't put in their own games. The purpose of this, of course, was to make gaming more attractive to women, or girls specifically. Now, they know that the moral outrage sentiment is ridiculous and pointless and has no basis in actual reality. However, they figured if they could convince enough useful idiots to serve as their army to harass and shame developers into doing their bidding, that it would help with their cause. And this is exactly what we've seen play out. As Mimi Ito, McIntosh's mentor, boss, and friend, arguably the top researcher in the field, claims that the moral panic is completely off base. He knew that from day one. He just was there to do his job. But let's get back to the book. Questions about what kids learn through games are a site of conflict among the values inflected by class, gender, and generational identity. The controversial nature of this medium becomes explicit, for instance, in the process of establishing a set of norms about the appropriate use of games. It goes on. Although certain core practices of recreational and geeked-out gaming are strongly associated with the young, white male geek cultures that were foundational to early game practice, today we see a much more variegated palette of gaming practices. The overall statistics of an expanding gamer demographic need to be contextualized within highly differentiated forms of gaming activities. Our effort here is to specify some of these distinctions among different forms of game engagement. Another pillar of feminist frequency's manifesto blown to smithereens. Apparently, Jonathan McIntosh has always known that gaming is about far more than straight white males. Again, we see them espousing a lie to serve a purpose, not because they believe it, but because they think it will spur society to change in a way that will lubricate it to allow for more serious games and in turn gamification of education to take hold. They know that the gamer demographic is totally diverse, but they try to act like it's all straight white men and it needs to change. They're using a fabricated crisis to try and push an agenda. The book continues. As described in Box 5.2 on first-person shooters, in recreational gaming, players can develop intense relationships to games. Unlike killing time and hanging out forms of gaming, with recreational gaming, we see a stronger identification with the historically dominant gamer demographic, young males. We discuss these dimensions of gamer identity later in this chapter, in the section on boundary work. Let's examine that section. Flows and boundaries of gaming. Gaming has been at the center of an ongoing cultural debate over what are appropriate forms of media for kids. A substantial part of this debate has included discussions of age and gender appropriateness. In our discussions with parents and gamers, we have found a range of perspectives on boundaries of gameplay, how kids should move in and out of game engagement, and what kinds of identities kids formed with games. This is the cultural context in which the practices of game-related learning and development unfold. Before we we conclude this chapter, this section reflects on the genres of gaming practice we have analyzed to consider the broader social and cultural contexts that frame gameplay and how kids move in and out of participation with gaming in particular game genres. Boundary work and gamer identity. Throughout the discussion of gaming genres, we touch on issues of gamer identity, particularly with how gamer identities intersect with gender and geek identities. This identity work differs depending on what forms of gaming practices are at play. While killing time and hanging out forms of gaming tend to have more inclusive identity profiles, recreational gaming and more mobilized forms of gaming tend to be more exclusionary and strongly associated with male geek identity. Within the genres of practice that we have called augmented gameplay, the practices associated with aesthetics and design tend to be gendered female, while those relying more on heavily technical expertise tend to be gendered male. These gender dynamics are not surprising given our existing knowledge about gender in games. To understand how these broader structural distinctions and divisions are produced, we need to understand how they emerge through different forms of play and talk. So now we receive further clarification on why feminist frequency is doing what it's doing. We've already seen the 2010 National Academy's report, which claimed that major development studios are scared of making serious games because they might receive consumer backlash from the core market, or even worse, might get sued by shareholders. But now we see that there is actually a two-pronged approach going on. See, feminist frequency's responsibility was to destroy the identity boundaries inherent to gaming, which Mimi Ito thinks gaming scares off from the hardcore gaming segments. See, you have to realize, Mimi Ito doesn't think hardcore gaming culture is toxic at all. If you actually read her work, her basic premise is that there's actually a lot of great social and life skills hardcore gamers get out of their work and play. She even praises the modding and machinima aspects that are deeply ingrained in the hardcore community. She loves how gamers learn teamwork and competitiveness and social skills and the ability to bounce back up and try again after failing until they eventually succeed. Her only real concern is that most girls tend to shy away from gaming because they think it's too masculine and too competitive, and she thinks that girls are really missing out on the great things that they could be getting out of gaming. She sees gaming as a gateway into other tech and science fields and feels that a lot more girls would end up going into the hard sciences or computer-related fields later on in life if they were involved in the more hardcore gaming aspects as children. See, all her studies say that most girls are mostly affiliated with the casual gaming aspects, and she wants them to get more involved in it. So feminist frequency was a prong of the attack that was supposed to change this and make gaming more appealing to women through cultural subversion and manipulation and shaming of developers and studios to do what MacArthur Foundation and Microsoft Research / Bill Gates wanted. And I'll explain fully what the second prong of the attack was in due time, but for now, let us return to the text. Producing particular forms of gamer identities is a form of boundary work. Almost without exception, kids we spoke to engaged in some forms of gaming, but they have well-developed discourses for distinguishing different kinds of gameplay identities. Players who engaged in the killing time and hanging out genres of gaming often describe their enjoyment of games, but they do not move beyond these more casual forms of gaming. These forms of gaming are considered everyday, unremarkable activities that are part of using computers in entertainment centers, and they were the most pervasive forms of gameplay that we encountered. The boundary work of creating gamer identity involves constructing boundaries between gamers and non-gamers, and kids who engage in the killing time practices are not generally considered gamers. Among boys, certain genres of gaming were ubiquitous and socially acceptable. These genres included sports games and first-person shooter games such as Counter-Strike and Halo. Among girls, the dominant social norm was that it was not socially acceptable to be identified as a gamer. In Dana Boyd's study, who was the Microsoft principal researcher, mind you, Teen Sociality and Network Publics, she interviewed two kids who talked about some of the gender dynamics around gaming. Catalina, a white 15-year-old from Texas, and Jordan, a Mexican-American, also 15 and from Texas, do not really play video games, but Jordan would love to get a PlayStation 3 because she thinks that Dance Dance Revolution looks fun. So here, we see Mimi using Microsoft researcher Dana Boyd's studies to prove a point. Now, Dana's studies go on to explore how girls saw their brothers play Counter-Strike but felt the medium was inaccessible to them, so they shied away from hardcore gaming altogether. So we know for a fact that Dana Boyd also knows that girls don't think it's socially acceptable to be considered a gamer, as her research portrays. So this is why Feminist Frequency made an abrupt decision to focus on making gaming a more welcoming place for girls. And of course, this is the same reason why someone convinced the 12 journalists to write their gamers are dead articles. It was an attempt to change the development landscape, to subversively alter the type of games that developers would be willing to make. But killing the gamer identity through games journalism was not intended to be the original plan. Again, what was the second prong of their original plan will be revealed shortly. The book continues. Young players such as Steven are part of the definition of the subcultures of forms of gaming, ones based on certain kind of gamer pride and defined against mainstream norms. Players of first-person shooters are demonized by the mainstream because of the violent content of the games. By contrast, MMORPG players are often stigmatized as being socially marginalized. Although first-person shooters and sports games were fairly ubiquitous among boys, it was rare for us to find MMORPG games in the mainstream teen demographic. This is partially due to the cost involved, but there are also important cultural distinctions between gamers. Here, the discourse revolves around commitment of time and energy to the online world, and both those on the inside and outside of these practices often describe them in these terms. For example, in her YouTube and video blogger study, Patricia Lang interviewed an 18-year-old who was an avid gamer, but who she says did not play World of Warcraft because role-playing games suck up too much time.
Hey, that's the same Patricia Lang that specializes in YouTube and video bloggers work, again emphasizing how important YouTube is to MacArthur.
It goes on, the rapid rate of technology change with regard to gaming is likely to continue to produce a generation gap in gaming experience, even for parents who are avid gamers. The processes of a distinction that core gamers engage in, defining their practices in opposition to mainstream culture, are likely to continue to produce an elite, geeked out gaming culture that will be out of reach to most of the older generation. The different forms of boundary work, of making distinctions between different kinds of gaming identities and between the world of gaming and mainstream culture, demonstrate how varied kids' gameplay experiences are. When considering how games contribute to learning of both the celebrated or demonized variety, we need to be specific about which forms of gaming and gaming identity we are referring to. Gaming practice is articulated in relation to the broader cultural and social dynamics of youth culture. Some of the most important outcomes of geeking out on games are experiences of mastery that translate into identity and status within peer groups that care about gaming and technical expertise. When one considers these dimensions, gender becomes important not only in terms of gender representation in video games, but also in terms of participation in certain social, cultural, and technical worlds. As gaming becomes increasingly central to young people's socialization into networks of technology expertise and learning, the persistent gender gap in recreational gaming is problematic. Although we are seeing a broadening base of participation in the killing time and hanging out genres of gaming, recreational gaming is still a male-dominated sphere. And in her conclusion, Mimi states, "Our work is not focused on the issues of gaming representation and content learning, but we focus on the broader social and cultural ecology that contextualizes game practice. We emphasize the importance of cultural genres of gameplay and how they intersect with identity formation such as geek and gender identity. Where we find some potential issues of concern are not in issues of game addiction and alienation, but rather the inverse, the issue of exclusion from certain forms of gaming. In line with research on gender in games, we found that there is a persistent gender gap in regard to the participation in forms of gaming that are tied to technology-related learning and forms of interest-driven participation. Although girls are participating at high levels and killing time hanging out in the less technical forms of modding and customizing, the core practices of recreational and mobilized gaming are culturally coded as male. We understand that sports are embedded in a broader cultural ecology that is worthwhile for kids to participate in. Here, we make a similar argument for games, that the most important benefits of gaming, if they are to be had, lie in healthy social ecology of participation, an ecology that includes parents, siblings, and peers. Recasting the debate over games and learning in this more ecological frame is an important corrective to many of the dominant discourses of gaming that have focused on game content and design. See, Mimi and Dana Boyd aren't actually game-hating zealots, and Macintosh isn't either. He only pretends to be as a way to alter society in a way that will change the gaming landscape to make more girls want to be involved in the more core aspects of gaming. On the other hand, now you see why Macintosh is tweeting things like, "We're in urgent need of games which aren't fun." He wants to correct the way games are viewed by the public to focusing on the more beneficial and social aspects instead. And combined with the knowledge that Sarkeesian has been a literal scam artist in her previous jobs before Feminist Frequency, it all starts to make sense. And when you add in the fact that both Macintosh and Sarkeesian are both known to be critical theory advocates, well, this is all beyond the scope of the presentation, but I suggest that you research how the basis of critical theory is that objective reasoning is dead and subjective reasoning is the only thing that matters in a modern society. An example of subjective reasoning is, how could I make $1 million? And an example of objective reasoning is pretty much anything that you learn in Philosophy 101. So they eschew any premise of truth or good or rightness, and instead focus solely on how to progress their emotionally charged agendas. This is why you see things like radical feminists throwing around patently false campus rape statistics, such as the claim that 1 in 4 college women are raped. We all know that the real numbers are lower by at least 2 orders of magnitude, but the elite radical feminists who use these rigged statistics know that their claim of 1 in 4 is a lie. But see, to them, it's all about a means to an end. That is the essence of what subjective reasoning is, devising which means are best to get the ends that you desire. Macintosh's desired ends are, of course, the gamification of education and a real market for serious games, which he knows will allow for rampant propagandization. So to achieve that, he's willing to boldface lie to the entire public, just the same as a KGB propagandist might do to subvert his mark. Remember, Macintosh calls himself a pop culture hacker. This is what he means by that. Oh, and in case anyone was wondering what the citation was for the claim that was made that violent games don't cause violence, well, here it is in its entirety. Although there are some indications that high level of play with mature rated video games is correlated with aggression, there is no conclusive evidence that there is a causative relation or that gameplay has any correlation with violent crime. After completing an extensive study of video games and violence, Kutcher and Olson conclude the strong link between video game violence and real-world violence, and the conclusion that video games lead to social isolation and poor interpersonal skills are drawn from bad or irrelevant research, muddle-headed thinking, and unfounded simplistic news reports. In this chapter, we do not engage directly with the empirical material on video games violence and aggressions, but rather we focus on the actual social practices of gaming and what game players describe as meaningful outcomes of their play. But now let's switch tracks and examine the other 2009 book which Mimi co-authored with Microsoft Research's Dana Boyd. It's titled Living and Learning with New Media, Summary of Findings from the Digital Youth Project. Here's the introduction. The MacArthur Foundation launches its 5-year, $50 million digital media and learning initiative in 2006 to help determine how digital media are changing the way young people learn, play, socialize, and participate in civic life. Answers are critical to developing educational and other institutions that can meet the needs of this and future generations. The initiative is both marshaling what is already known about the field and seeding innovation for continued growth. Seeding innovation for continued growth. Seems like that's what Macintosh's job was here. Now, noteworthy excerpts from the book include social and recreational new media use
as a site of learning. Contrary to adult perceptions, while hanging out online, youth are picking up basic social and technological skills they need to fully participate in contemporary society. Erecting barriers to participation deprives teens of access to these forms of learning. Participation in the digital age means more than just being able to access serious online information and culture. Youth could benefit from educators being more open to forms of experimentation and social exploration that are generally not characteristics of educational institutions. So apparently, Mimi here is advocating surfing pole on 8chan for history class, which is actually one area I agree with her on. It's been said that pole is always right for the classroom setting. But seriously, other interesting excerpts include, for example, authoring of online profiles is an important literacy skill on both the friendship and interest-driven sides, but one mobilizes a genre of popularity and coolness, and the other a genre of geek cred. Similarly, the elite language of committed gamers involves literacies that are of little and possibly negative value for boys looking for a romantic partner in their school peer networks. Not only are literacy standards diverse and culturally specific, but they are constantly changing in tandem with technical changes and a rising bar of cultural sophistication. Following from this, it is problematic to develop a standardized or static set of benchmarks to measure kids' levels of new media and technical literacy. On the interest-driven side, we saw adult leadership in these groups as central to how standards for expertise and literacy are being defined. For example, the heroes of the gaming world include both teens and adults who define the identity and practice of an elite gamer. The same holds for all of the creative production groups that we examined. The leadership in this space, however, is largely cut off from the educators and policymakers who are defining standards for new media literacy in the adult-dominated world. Building more bridges among these different communities of practice could shape awareness on both the in-school and out-of-school sides if we could respond in a coordinated and mutually respectful way to the quickly evolving norms and expertise of technically sophisticated experimental new media literacies. By the way, what she refers to as media literacy in this context is basically what one might consider being technically and socially affluent in gaming and/or social media. She argues that if academics want to harness the good aspects of gaming and social media for the purposes of education and learning, there needs to be some outreach between academia and the gamer culture. This is what feminist frequency was intended to be, supposed to be a stepping stone to link the two sides of academia and gamer culture. They were intended to dissolve the cultural boundaries between the two, but they failed miserably. They didn't expect the backlash they received because the core gaming demographic is totally immune to subversion and manipulation. In retrospect, Mimi, and I know you're watching, you should have seen this all coming a mile away. All you had to do is refer back to a quote, which you yourself were cited for in the 2011 Academy's paper. It reads, "Parental involvement can have mixed effects on people's interest in and use of video games. Researchers have found that many children, as they enter their late elementary and teen years, become more resistant to adults dictating their media choices." Did you catch that? Here we have someone who has literally done tons of research on games and decided that adults or even young adults don't like having their games dictated to them. On the other hand, they like being able to choose their own and play what they want to play. And I'm not sure how this works, but for some reason, Miss Ito thinks that she could put her own personal propaganda minister, Jonathan McIntosh Goebbels, in a position where he can dictate what games the industry can and can't have. Yes, a woman who knows that adults don't like having their parents choose their game thinks she can get away with having daddy tell us what we can and can't play. And we don't even need to get into Jonathan's partner in crime's connections to digress through her mentor at university, Jennifer Jensen, to see that Feminist Frequency's decision in 2011 to abruptly switch topics solely to video games criticism on how the status quo needs to change was
not organic at all. It was a coordinated and planned attack to attempt to alter gaming culture in a way that could usher in serious games. And now I'm afraid to say, you will never succeed now that we know what you're doing. But now let us examine Mimi Ito's 2008 book to glean some more insight on the situation regarding the current climate and ecosystem of serious games. In 2008, Mimi Ito authored a book which was again financed by the MacArthur Foundation titled Learning Race and Ethnicity, Youth and Digital Media. Notable excerpts include, although analysts are still assessing opportunities in serious games markets, education, government, health, military, corporations and industry, first responders and science, some estimates have put total figures in excess of 100 billion. More conservative estimates have put market share for serious game development work at 1 billion. Historically, black colleges are taking notice. Howard University's College of Engineering, Architecture, and Computer Sciences recently held its first one-day computer and video games workshop. The workshop assisted the university in positioning itself as a supplier of creative talent for the games industry and as a conductor of leading games research. Panelist Nicole Bradford, Senior Globalist Brand Manager of Vivendi Universal, one of the leading black females in the game industry, John Nordlinger, a Microsoft Research Games Evangelist, and Adam Clayton Power III, Director of the Integrated Media Systems Center of the National Science Foundation's exclusive Engineering Research Center for Multimedia and Internet Research, described the present and future states of the game industry in discussions about research, curriculum, and business considerations. Notice that she mentioned the same John Nordlinger that we see introduce all the serious games videos for Microsoft Research, and the same John Nordlinger that claimed to be in charge of the Serious Games Initiative at Microsoft in 2007.
Hello, I'm John Nordlinger, and I'm very pleased to announce Marilee Mayo from the National Academy is here to speak. I met Marilee for the first time a year and a half ago, where she got up on stage at an event Microsoft was putting on, and she said basically that given the popularity of gaming and the unpopularity of stringent education is the way one can benefit from the other. And given her position as a director with the National Academies, I thought this was a very nice person to come here and tell us the same powerful message as we embark on our own efforts. A couple announcements. We're going to break after this and go in the cafeteria, so if anybody has any questions they'd like to follow up, we'll be in a booth drinking coffee. Tomorrow Ben Sawyer will be presenting at the same time. Ben's with the Serious Games Initiative, and he'll be doing a very complimentary talk. And I was looking for somebody from LCA. There's nobody from LCA in here, is there? Okay, but I'd certainly like to meet you all, so if you want to introduce yourself to me, this is an initiative I'm running in Microsoft Research, and I'd love to chat with you about it.
Thank you very much.
Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
And then the book goes on to state, Mario Armstrong of NPR Technology sees increasing participation of minority youth on the consumer side, but not on the business side. As for who is missing, he adds, nonprofits, foundations, venture capitalists, video game publishers, and the entertainment side of the industry are all missing from the equation. Now, this statement from Mario Armstrong is important, but we will dissect it later and see why. But for now, it's important to see how Dana, Macintosh, and Mimi really tie together. The first clue came from that goofy-looking guy that said that Macintosh took his picture back in 2007, Howard Rangdahl. I found an interview he did for the Connected Learning Alliance, which Mimi Ito is a director of. So let's listen to that clip.
Welcome to a conversation powered by Connected Learning, where we chat with some of today's leading minds about new learning approaches designed for the demands and opportunities of the digital age. Connected Learning values the new ways many young people today access information, gain expertise, and learn alongside peers and mentors using the internet, social networks, and digital technology. We're excited you're here to join the conversation as we seek to make learning relevant.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I am Jeff Brazil with the Connected Learning Alliance. And today, as part of our current podcast series, Make Learning Relevant. We are chatting with Howard Reingold about connected learning. And if there's anyone who epitomizes a connected learner and a connected teacher, it's Howard. Hi, Howard, and thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Entirely my pleasure, Jeff.
So let me give Howard's bio, which is a wonderful thing to do, and there's many places to go with it, but I want to cover the places that I think are relevant and very cool. Howard, among many other things, is a writer, a community builder, online learning expert, and instructor at Stanford University, and has taught at UC Berkeley as well, University of California at Berkeley, and really is one of the driving people and intellects behind our technology-enabled collaboration, collective action, and social learning. And most recently, Howard's been concentrating on learning and teaching 21st century literacies. And I'm very privileged to be able to say I get to work with Howard on a number of projects, and so appreciate it. There's sort of consensus that education and learning and our approach to learning needs an upgrade to move it from 20th century into the 21st century.
I've been very excited about developments around digital media and learning that are not so much about the technology as the way the technology affords student empowerment over their learning and gives some of the responsibility as well as the power over their learning back to the student, and I think equips them better to deal with the world that changes very rapidly. You can't go and have the facts delivered to you every day. You're going to have to figure out your place in the world on a daily basis more and more often.
Howard, there are so many efforts and individuals that are trying to, quote unquote, reimagine or rethink learning and education. And you've been at this and in this space for a while. And I'm curious, just from your vantage point, first I was curious to know, how did you get into the work? What was sort of the occasion for that? And what do you personally want to see happen as a result of your work, but also these others that are kind of joining in on a weekly basis?
Well, how I got into it is kind of a strange little story, in that a friend of mine at University of California at Berkeley said, we're having a reading group around your book, Smart Mobs, my 2002 book. Would you like to join us? And I thought, well, that sounds like fun. It's kind of like a book group, but it's about my book, so I don't have to study. I know what's in it. One of the students in that reading group, by the name of Dana Boyd, went to the dean and said, I don't want a reading group, I want a course so that I can get credit for it. So suddenly, I am thrust into being a college instructor without ever having planned to be and without any training. And B, in my first class, one of my students is Dana Boyd, who's an intimidating intellect even back then.
So apparently, Dana convinced Mr. Reingold to start teaching. And then we see in Dana's biography on her own personal site that she claims she got her PhD under the guidance of Mimi Ito. And she also claims there that her dissertation research was funded by MacArthur. It reads, in 2008, I completed my PhD at the School of Information at the University of California, Berkeley. My dissertation research was funded as a part of the MacArthur Foundation's initiative on new media and learning. My research was supervised by a most astonishing committee: Mimi Ito, Annalise Saxenian, Corey Hayden, and Jenna Burrell. Yes, Mimi Ito was Dana's professor and mentor, and Mimi's company paid for Dana's research. Then, after she got her PhD, they have been working together ever since. And like I've already said, they're working on another book together that should be released in November. And it's also worth noting that the new Media and Learning Division of MacArthur Foundation that funded her research, which of course Mimi Ito is in charge of, is also the same division that Jonathan McIntosh works for. Then when we listen to Mimi Ito's interview on her own Connected Learning Alliance site, we can ascertain some more information.
Hi, my name is Lissa Soep, and I'm delighted to be in conversation with Mimi Ito, one of the architects of the concept of connected learning. So let's jump in, and I'll first just say about myself that I am research director and senior producer at Youth Radio in Oakland, and the founder of our Innovation Lab, which is a partnership with MIT Media Lab, and also a member of the Youth and Participatory Politics Research Network that is part of the Digital Media and Learning Initiative. And Mimi and I have worked together for some time. So maybe I'm going to ask you to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, Lisa. Well, it's great to be here with you. It's really been fabulous having you as a partner in the work, and I'm happy to be here to talk about connected learning. My role in connected learning, I have several hats. One is that I'm faculty at the University of California, Irvine, where I help lead the Digital Media and Learning Hub, which is based at the Humanities Research Institute. And that is really a networking hub where we sponsor events and we build online resources and community opportunities around digital media and learning, and more recently around connected learning. And I also am chair of the MacArthur Foundation funded research network on connected learning, where we are running a lot of research projects, both qualitative and quantitative in nature, really working through the model of connected learning. And I've also had the great privilege of helping launch the Connected Learning Alliance as part of the leadership team. But it can be as simple as something that the National Writing Project, for example, one of our partners has been advocating for, is to let young people write about things that they are interested in or things that happen in their real lives.
And what do you see as the hardest thing about this work? Where do you struggle the most?
I think the hardest thing is the fact that our institutional structures and accountabilities are really not geared towards this model of learning, and that it takes time to change them. Assessments and testing are a big part of it, but also, things like the way the school day is structured, the lack of connections between resources in the community and the school, and the difficulty of, bringing in, say, a local expert or volunteer who could help support those more specialized and enriched learning experience in the school. There's a lot of policy and legal barriers to making those kinds of things happen. So those are challenges. Another example is just the concerns about online safety, that often prevent schools or libraries from connecting young people to online communities that are social in nature. So I think those policy barriers are really, really challenging and really work against, for example, even educators who really want to embrace progressive or connected learning to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that the online world has to offer. I think that the other big challenge is, again, because this is really about a model of learning that spans different environments, young people's peer culture and their social learning, their home environments, their out-of-school learning, their in-school learning, that it really requires building of an alliance that cuts across these different sectors, sectors that aren't always used to working harmoniously together. So if you think about the alliance of partners that we work with, for example, they cut across the for-profit sectors of technology and entertainment. We do work that is very parent and home-facing. We do work in informal educational institutions, whether that's libraries or museums or maker spaces. And we also have many partners who are in the in-school space. And building an alliance across such a heterogeneous network of stakeholders is a really important but difficult challenge.
Oh, it's something I haven't really got into yet. See, during the making of this presentation, Mimi Ito caught wind of the fact that we were onto her because I had hinted on Twitter that Feminist Frequency's entire narrative was about to be blown apart by their very own team. The tweet ended up getting more attention than I intended because of the infamous transsexual pedophile known as SRH Butts, who screen capped the conversation and used it in an attempt to write me off as some paranoid schizophrenic. Of course, I nearly died laughing, but what happened next was a little surprising. Apparently, someone who knew that Mimi was the one who would destroy the Feminist Frequency's narrative tipped her off. See, well, a trusted helper of mine was halfway through downloading all the podcasts from the Connected Learning Alliance's website, suddenly all the podcasts were deleted off of SoundCloud. Mimi Ito had wiped the whole channel. Of course, I had already grabbed all the pertinent podcasts and had them backed up onto secure external storage, so I wasn't too concerned, but it's worth mentioning that apparently Ito thinks that there is something really worth hiding in the files, and I haven't even been able to listen to all of them yet, so I need help scouring through the 40 hours of podcasts, Microsoft research videos, papers, books, and reports, which I was able to obtain during my research. Okay, I did the best I could with the time and resources I had available, but I need your help to really dissect it all. So please, download and seed the torrent linked in the info box and help dig through the information to make sure that we've got everything. But now, let's focus back on Mimi Ito's Connected Learning Alliance. As we clearly see, the bottom of the page says that the CLA is funded solely by the MacArthur Foundation. It says that Mimi Ito serves as Research Director of the Digital Media and Learning Research Hub and also as the chair of the Connected Learning Research Network. The research arm of the Connected Learning Alliance is Connected Learning Research, which is hosted on MacArthur's Digital Media and Learning Initiative website. Now, it just so happens that the Digital Media and Learning Hub holds a yearly conference. The primary sponsor in 2011 was MacArthur, and the secondary sponsor was Microsoft Research. On March 5th, 2011, there was a panel which was hand-picked and organized by none other than Dana Boyd, as I will prove to you in a minute, who, as I've stated, is a principal researcher for Microsoft Research and also works for MacArthur. See, Dana Boyd was the Emerging Platforms and Policy Chair of the 2011 DML conference, and Mimi Ito was a plenary panelist. And if you don't know what plenary means in this context, the definition of plenary session is a meeting for all members attending a conference, either at the beginning to discuss general issues or at the end to announce progress. So Mimi Ito was one of the main panelists who was the moderator for many of the panels and gave speeches both at the beginning and end of the conference. This makes sense being that she's the research director of the research arm of the DML. Now, as I've said, Dana Boyd was the Emerging Platforms and Policy Chair for the DML and also on many of the panels, the planning committee of the event, and was also in charge of picking at least one of the panels. So guess who was the strapping young lad that she handpicked to be on her panel? None other than our good friend Mr. Macintosh. Here we could see Jonathan tweeting about how happy he was to show off the beta version of his app at the convention, an app that made it trivial to remix commercials into propaganda. And here we can see Jonathan linking a tweet to a live blog of the debate he had with some guy about 4chan. Now, this link was a live blog of the event, so it was written rather hastily, but let's have a look and see what it says. With Mizuko Ito, moderator, Finn Brunton, and Andres Monroy Hernandez, Mimi Ito kicks off. Credits Dana Boyd with putting together the panel. Industry calls this user-generated content, but educators we look at online spaces for amateurs and various groups to connect, mobilize, find others who share interests and identities, and how to create new forms. Networked spaces offer possibilities for peer-based learning and for collective action and mobilization, drive participation and engagement. Now, for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to get into the content of what was actually said on this panel, although I will say that Finn's analysis of 4chan is downright hilarious, and I would suggest giving it a read if you want a good chuckle. All Macintosh does on the panel is whine about getting videos taken down on YouTube or getting strikes against his account, and then he ironically states that being anonymous in an online movement does not discredit you at all. But then he claims it does with Gamergate. But the important thing to take away from this all is that Dana Boyd, a principal Microsoft researcher, personally chose John Macintosh to be on the panel. And of course, Dana's former professor and current co-worker, as well as Jonathan's boss, Mimi Ito, was the moderator. It's quite interesting when we look at Dana's tweet from October 2010 when she named who the panel members were supposed to be for that March 2011 event. Originally, Moot was supposed to be on the panel, but apparently he backed out and that Finn guy took his place. But what's interesting here is Moot had been in contact with Mimi Ito since at least 2010. Think about it. It's also worth noting that Dana was also a speaker at the event, but on different panels. Howard Rangdahl, Macintosh's good friend since at least 2007, interviewed all the planning committee members for the DML 2011 conference. Let's watch a clip of Dana's interview.
Here's Dana Boyd. We all know Dana, and we're all interested in hearing what is exciting to you about the area at the DML conference coming up that you're chairing.
Sure. So I'm honored to be able to chair the Emerging Platforms and Policies section. And my goal in this space is that there's a lot of amazing technology that has come out that has been deployed often by corporate institutions, and people are sort of struggling to make sense of it. They're trying to figure out how they can use it for learning purposes. They're trying to figure out how they navigate it for social purposes. And so the point of this track is to really examine what happens with these new emerging technologies, how are people engaging with them, and what are the big struggles or challenges we have to think about. So, this includes all of the sort of classic platforms, Facebook, MySpace, Twitter, YouTube, Ustream, these kinds of things that are coming out, and all of the sort of questions of how people are using it, as well as the policy questions. The policy questions, things like safety or privacy, things like security, things like norms, what's socially acceptable, and how are these things configured through the combination of people, their practices, and the technology itself.
What kind of issues would you like people to be thinking about, or questions in regard to that? Before
Sure.
you meet them?
So I guess, it's one of the ways that I've been thinking about it is I've been thinking about some in terms of sort of the privacy and safety questions, right? And, what are the role of educators? What are the role of parents? What are the role of teenagers? Who plays a role in this, especially with regard to youth and learning how to navigate these spaces? So that's one section that I imagine having a great conversation. Another section I think will be really interesting is about what it means to engage in a new type of public world. And so these questions about publicity, these questions of what are the social norms when we have people from around the globe, sort of colliding, how do people understand context and what's socially appropriate, and, how do we think through these questions of reputation and social practices, etc. Another big sort of section is around this whole question of user-generated content, right? So all of these tools provide this platform where people can contribute it. So what does it mean to contribute to this kind of space? What are questions of anonymity? What is, the politics of participation? How do people think about getting reputation or credibility? Who owns this content? How do we think about whether this content is credible? All of these sort of nasty, gnarly questions. So those are sort of the three pillars that I'm, sort of most thinking through. But part of what's nice about being able to put together a space like this is to say, what are people going to be interested in? Like, I'm looking forward to all of the possible panels that people might propose, trying to think through and navigate these different spaces.
But when we look back at Mimi's bio, which I've already read, it states, she has led a 3-year collaborative ethnographic study funded by the MacArthur Foundation, examining new media practices in the U.S. and focusing on gaming, digital media production, and internet use. The findings of this project are reported in Hanging Out, Messing Around, and Geeking Out, Youth Living and Learning with New Media. And of course, as I've already mentioned, Dana Boyd was the co-author of that book. So Dana is also directly paid by the MacArthur Foundation as a research affiliate, but also Dana is directly paid by the MacArthur Foundation at Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet and Society, a society which advises internet policy to lawmakers. Let's look at what her bio there has to say. At the Berkman Center, Dr. Boyd co-directed the Internet Safety Technical Task Force in 2008 with John Palfrey and Dina Seiko to work with companies and nonprofits to identify potential technical solutions for keeping children safe online. This task force was formed by the U.S. Attorneys General and MySpace and is being organized by the Berkman Center. More recently, Dr. Boyd co-directed the Youth Media and Policy Working Group with John Praffy and Urs Gazer. This project was funded by the MacArthur Foundation from 2009 to 2011. In 2011, Dana Boyd was selected as a Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum. She's on the Social Media Global Agenda Council for the World Economic Forum. She is on the Electronic Privacy Information Center's Board of Advisors. In 2010, Dr. Boyd won the Citations Award for Public Sociology. The Financial Times dubbed Dr. Boyd the High Priestess of Internet Friendship, while Fortune magazine identified her as the smartest academic in tech. She was identified as one of Technology Review's 2010 Young Innovators Under 35. Previously, she was an associate fellow at Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology, and Sociology, and on the board of directors of the New Media Consortium. In 2008 through 2009, she was a commissioner of the Knight Commission on Information Needs of Communities in a Democracy. But hey, when we look at this Berkman Society, you never guess who some of the other members are. We have here none other than Wikipedia's Jimmy Wales and Feministing's Jessica Valenti. Well, that certainly cleared up any questions as to why Jimmy Wales broke his own site's policy and endorsed a biased description of the Gamergate controversy. And also, Mimi Ito's brother, Joy Ito, is a member. It's worth noting that he's a bigwig at MIT and on the board of MacArthur-backed Creative Commons, where he used to be a chair. That's a funny coincidence. You know who else backs Creative Commons financially? Yeah, Bill Gates has given them millions. Mimi Ito's brother's nonprofit has received $10 million in funding directly from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation since 2011, as well as being directly backed by the MacArthur Foundation, as Creative Commons is actually one of their programs. But here's another strange coincidence. On Anita Sarkeesian's LinkedIn page, it lists her in exactly two groups. One is Feminists in Games, and the other is Creative Commons, which is Mimi Ito's brother's company, which is backed by MacArthur and Gates, as I've already said. But I digress. Let's focus back on this subject of Mimi, Dana, and Macintosh once again. You know, the people who matter here. It's no coincidence that on that 2011 panel, which Dana handpicked, which had Macintosh on it, there was also one of her fellow Berkman Society co-workers. Yeah, that Hernandez guy is also a member there. And Dana's also the chair of some family safety initiative. Won't somebody think of the children? But let's focus here. In reality, Dana Boyd is a political radical, just like Macintosh, who shares the same ambitions of using technology to change the political landscape. Let's watch some of her presentation she did about technology and politics here.
Good morning. Now, the key to understanding this actually starts from the teenagers. They're an amazing population for making sense of what's going on in trends that are larger and more expansive than what's necessarily in the adult space. For those who aren't familiar with my work, I'm an ethnographer. I spend a lot of time running around the United States talking to people about how they use technology. And for the last 4 years, I've been traversing the United States talking to American teenagers. Now, all of this would be really fine and dandy if friendship and aesthetics and values weren't inherently intertwined with issues of race, socioeconomic status, education, and other factors that usually make up how we think about the notions of class. But they are. The further into the analysis you get, the more uncomfortable the data starts to feel. In many ways, adult worlds are even more divided than teenagers. Adults are less likely to know adults who aren't like them, as noted by the fact that this is a very democratic, biased environment. There's a notion in sociology called homophily. It means birds of a feather stick together. Whites know whites, Democrats know Democrats, urbanites know urbanites, etc., etc. And before you immediately start listing the people that you might think you know that are different than you, start to realize this is the auto reaction when we deal with an uncomfortable truth that we don't like to actually face. More colloquially and sort of snarkily is referred to my black friend. It's extremely problematic the way we live in these very segregated worlds, in a world where we think that these boundaries are actually collapsing. And more importantly, the digital technologies are manifesting and reproducing these in ways that we have to face. So one thing to keep in mind about social media, the internet mirrors and magnifies all of the pre-existing dynamics. And it makes different kinds of realities much more visible. Racial divisions in the United States are not shocking to anyone, but the fact that they're being reinforced and reinscribed through technology should make us all worry a little bit. A lot more people are following 50 Cent and Miley Cyrus and engaged in communities where it's about fandom and around celebrity than they are necessarily about politics. So just because a site can support different kinds of politics doesn't mean that you're actually reaching the audiences that are necessarily participating there. First off, social stratification is pervasive in American society and around the globe. Social media does not immediately eradicate the inequality, and rather it mirrors and magnifies what we're seeing in everyday life. It makes social divisions visible in totally new ways. We no longer are able to put them under the ground, but we have an amazing opportunity to actually embrace them and deal with them. We desperately need to address the issues of access and media literacy, but we also really need to re-engage with the broader conceptual issues around inequality, intolerance, and social divisions. Technology isn't the savior, but it sure can highlight the work we need to do. So my hope for you listening today is that each and every one of you will begin to look at the work you do and think about social media with a critical eye. It's a tremendous time filled with amazing case studies, but it's also a harrowing time where we need to account for some of the problems that are going on. And if we don't, we will further perpetuate them. Thank you for listening.
I think now would be a good time to remind you of the quote Mimi Ito made on her blog when she took ownership of her Macintosh and calling him our media curator. And here is Bill and Melinda Gates' official media arm, the Impatient Optimist, referring specifically to the research paper Mimi and Dana co-authored together. Notice that the Impatient Optimist website flies the Gates Foundation banner in the same way as the grants database. This is literally the Gates Foundation's very own media arm. So let's read some of this press release, and we find something very interesting. Cultural anthropologist Mimi Ito calls the Chicago Public Library's pioneering teen learning space, U-Media, loud, sociable, and hip. But it's still all about the public mission of the library to serve as a point of access to culture, information, and the media of the day, staffed by smart guides to knowledge and literacy. She should know her research has helped inform the program where teens can geek out, consuming and creating information and new media. Funded in partnership by the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Like U-Media, the new labs will empower teens to use and create digital and traditional media in partnership with mentors and peers, to explore their interests and passions in ways that promote creativity, critical thinking, and hands-on learning. Want to know who one of those mentors who was to teach the kids on how to create media was? Yep, none other than John McIntosh. Remember, we have video evidence that that was his job there for MacArthur. Yes, Bill and Melinda Gates were referring to Jonathan McIntosh and seemed to think that his propaganda techniques will help change the world. And being a MacArthur employee and being that Mozilla is a MacArthur organization through and through, they flew McIntosh out to Mozilla Festival in 2011 to attend the conference. He even put a bunch of pictures of it up on his Flickr. And just to pile some more evidence on that, McIntosh's true intentions have always been to be influential in education. Well, here's McIntosh blogging about how he showed off his app to make it easy to make propaganda at a different Mozilla convention. This time, it was a science fair. His app was marketed to target educators who would then have their students use the app in their classroom. Now, this is why Jonathan wants gamification in education so badly, so that the coursework could be used for political indoctrination. You know, the type of uses that were outlined in the National Academy's 2010 report, which we've gone over at the beginning of this thing. But let's jump back to the press release from Bill and Melinda Gates in 2011, which I just mentioned. A company called U-Media was referred to. Now, the co-founder of that company is also a board member of the Connected Learning Alliance, as well as the founder of the Digital Youth Network. Now, as we've already seen, McIntosh is involved with the Connected Learning Alliance as well. So let's watch a clip of him doing a quote webinar for Connected Learning TV in January 2014, only 8 months before Gamergate kicked off.
We were able to coordinate at least 25 different occupations that participated in shutting down ports or, in the case of Austin, shipping roads, in order to raise awareness about the movement and, of course, labor issues having to do with the distribution of goods. Another experiment in the same vein was to coordinate different cities to do Occupy ALEC, which was the F-29 action, and then we rolled out the May 1st general strike. And all of this coordination it's not necessarily all done within Interop. Part of it is done outside of InterOccupy with just informal networks, but we sought to just be a place that would collect, like an information clearinghouse, that would collect all the information, have it in one place, and be constantly issuing more and more calls for action as they arose. One of the actions that most people don't associate with Occupy, but definitely got its start through the infrastructure of InterOccupy, was the Million Hoodies for Trayvon. And Million Hoodies is a group that has used the infrastructure provided by InterOccupy to get started, and then has taken that and moved so far beyond anything that we had envisioned. And some of us have been more involved and less involved in that, but it's been...
Jonathan, if you answer this question of walking us through an example of how your campaign unfolded, and what did you envision for that campaign, and what happened to it in its digital afterlife?
Sure. So, I've been involved in a whole bunch of grassroots activist-style campaigns for the past really 10 or 11 years, but I thought I would talk about one that's more based on the battle of the story in the media. So this is something that I did pretty much on my own to see what impact and what influence I could have on changing a popular story, or a story that was happening in the popular culture. So I thought that might be more useful to talk about, or interesting for people who are listening. So in 2009, there was a very popular movie slash book series called Twilight, and I had seen the film, and I had read portions of the book, and I was frustrated with it, and I looked at the media culture around it, and I looked at the blogosphere. And so the conversations that were happening around this book, and specifically around the relationship between the two lead characters, Bella and Edward, there were a lot of things that were red flags for domestic abuse, right? A lot of things that were red flags for framing things that were stalking behavior or abusive behavior as romantic, right? And so that sort of runs through these books. And so what I would see in the blogosphere and on Twitter and everywhere else was all these people saying, isn't it awesome and great the way that this character Edward just treating Bella, and I want something like that in my own life, right? And this is a guy who, in the movie, I was watching the movie, and I couldn't believe it, because he sneaks into her bedroom and he watches her sleep without her consent, and they haven't even met yet, right? And he like forbids her from seeing her friends, and he takes apart her car. He does all these things that are like super red flags.
Oh, and by the way, that woman who was sitting next to the moderator on that quote webinar was the same woman, Lissa, who interviewed Mimi Ito for her official podcast, which she since deleted. And here's Johnny tweeting about his appearance there. So we already know that the Connected Learning Alliance is affiliated with Microsoft Research through Dana Boyd, but are they also in direct contact with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? Duh. How do I know that? Well, because they interviewed a Gates Foundation bigwig on one of their podcasts on the Connected Learning Alliance website.
Welcome to a conversation powered by Connected Learning, where we chat with some of today's leading minds about new learning approaches.
Today, we are really fortunate to have with us Karina Wong. Karina serves as the Deputy Director of Education at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She leads the College Ready Work portfolio, which is focused on creating the conditions for student success by investing in teachers and improving the work they do. Her investments include efforts to help teachers implement the Common Core in their classrooms, opportunities for teachers to form networks and collaborate virtually in more innovative and intelligent ways. Yes, that sort of touches on the issue of assessment and outcomes. How do we go about making changes in that area?
Yeah, I made several investments in game-based investments. That's what I'll call, to think about how to use games for
how to use games, how to use games, how to use games, how to use games
for learning and for assessment.
For learning and for assessment.
And I really believe in the power of those kinds of innovations. And the question is, how do we begin to think about them or adopt them in schools?
How do we begin to adopt them in schools? How do we begin to adopt them in schools?
And how do we begin to recognize or validate what kids actually learn in different ways? And I think that is a really tough question, because I think our current assessment, evaluation, accountability systems are not set up for sort of that V3 way of thinking about proficiency.
Maybe this was part of the info which Mimi Ito was trying to stop us from downloading by deleting the CLA's podcast from SoundCloud.
Too late, I already got it.
Now, we've seen some clips of Macintosh at a 2013 MacArthur panel, which was at the 4th Annual Transmedia Hollywood Forum, but according to a tweet from Mimi, she also placed him on the 2010 panel, which sounds like it was the exact same sort of thing. So Macintosh retweets that, but what's interesting is we can also see Macintosh tweeting support of Mimi Ito's work with YOUmedia, and he even links to an article Mimi Ito wrote for the Huffington Post about it, titled, "When Youth Own the Public Education Agenda."
Get real.
Gates owns the public education agenda at this point. Notable excerpts include, "If we think of the mission of public education as providing learning opportunities to all young people and not only about supporting public schools, YOUmedia represents some of the best of what public education has to offer in the 21st century. The Obama administration has recognized this, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services recently announced that they would work with the MacArthur Foundation in scaling the YOUmedia effort to 30 more libraries across the country." So there you go. Apparently Obama has his hand in this as well. But let's go back to Mimi's tweet from 2010 talking about how Jonathan McIntosh was their media curator for an event. Well, I also found a tweet by Mimi saying that she's the one who organized that event. And then we found an interview of McIntosh by some MIT guy who just happens to work with Ito's brother about the event. And then we have Macintosh talking about the interview on his own personal website as well. And, you know, Mimi retweets the interview, showing her never-ending support for Macintosh. I mean, John, Dana, Mimi, I know you're all watching this. I have one question for you. How dumb do you really think that we are? Did you actually think that nobody would expose you? But, you know, when you really think about it, it actually makes sense that Macintosh is a fraud trying to manipulate society, with the goal being to usher in an era of serious and educational games and expanded gaming demographics, and eventually the gamification of education in public schools, which the purpose of that is, of course, political indoctrination of the youth, as well as using the data mining capability of games for assessment to replace standardized tests. But yeah, it makes sense that he's a fraud, because the term that he refers to himself as, a cultural hacker, well, that's just a pretty way of saying subversive propagandist. And when you look at some of his blog posts, he actually admits that he's subversive, but being a propaganda artist, he has to propagandize his very own term for it. And the political remixes that he gained notoriety for were the former main outlet for his propaganda. But of course now, Feminist Frequency is. So it should be no surprise that he was on board with the plan to use Feminist Frequency as a platform to manifest industry reform, whether he actually believes the rhetoric that he espouses or not. For him, Feminist Frequency was just a tool, along with all the mindless social justice warriors who were eager to listen and believe. Now, let's go back to that Connected Learning Alliance website for a second. It lists one of their partners as being the National Writing Project, and we actually heard Mimi Ito say that in her interview.
Something that the National Writing Project, for example, one of our partners has been advocating for,
which of course was deleted. The National Writing Project is directly funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and they've received about $4 million in grants from the foundation since 2010, $3.5 million of which was explicitly meant to promote Common Core. And guess who else is a partner of the MacArthur Foundation? Games for Change. And Games for Change, coincidentally, chose Anita Sarkeesian to be a judge there. And Games for Change is also supported by the Department of Education and sponsored by a company called Shell Games, which is run by the former IGDA head who gave a presentation to Microsoft Research about the gamification of education in 2010. And of course, they're supported by DIGRA and the IGDA as well. Is it all starting to make sense now? What's really going on? Here's the DML Research Hub, which of course Ito is in charge of, tweeting support for Games for Change. The DML Research Hub and Carnegie Mellon is listed as a major financial supporter plus a content provider. And Carnegie Mellon has worked directly with Ben Sawyer in the past, which was the creator of the Microsoft-backed Serious Games initiative. And he wrote a book about serious games in 2004. But want to see something really funny? We have Anna Everett, which is an employee of the MacArthur Foundation, giving an interview talking about Anita Sarkeesian in July 2014. But it turns out that Anna Everett was actually the editor of Mimi Ito's 2006 book on learning race and digital media, which I talked about previously. But want to see something really crazy though? Well, the DML Hub runs something called the DML Hub Competition, the director of which is David Theo Goldberg, who's also the executive director of the DML Hub itself, where Mimi Ito serves as the chair and is the director of the research arm. Well, they specifically speak about Anita Sarkeesian, and they also espouse total lies against Gamergate. I mean, I can't even believe the things that they say. It reads, Anita Sarkeesian recently observed, online harassment, especially gendered online harassment, is an epidemic. Women are being driven out. They're being driven offline. This isn't just in gaming. This is happening across the board online, especially with women who participate in or work in male-dominated industries. Sarkeesian is one of many women who have been publicly harassed and threatened for feminist and anti-racist work. In addition to impacting women and girls in gaming, effects of the so-called Gamergate phenomenon have spread to those who support women and girls in connected environments. By seeding this space with existing best practices, we will immediately redress the difficulty in sourcing information about combating online harassment. By creating a living space that accepts contributions, we will be able to better keep up with the speed of digital culture in which new forms of risk and harassment emerge with frightening speed. The proposal content reads, diversity, civility, and inclusivity. While Gamergate has illuminated the long-standing violence against women in gaming, the phenomenon is hardly limited to gamer culture. According to a recent Pew study, 1 in 4 women have experienced online stalking or sexual harassment. Labeled as social justice warriors, prominent journalists and bloggers have been harassed and threatened for writing about economic inequality, education, and racism in popular culture. The culture of fear that is being created impacts not just journalists, but more perniciously, young women and men who are developing their habits and protocols for online life. From advanced professionals to adolescents, feminists and women are at risk. Much of this violence has been perpetuated online, but threats like these can move into offline, real life. Wait, what? I can't even read this with a straight face. Much of this violence has been perpetuated online. Mimi, do you understand that words actually have meanings, they have definitions, and you can't just change them willy-nilly? Although I do realize that propaganda artists like you make a habit out of perverting the English language to push your agendas, but let me just continue reading this libellous garbage. In October, Sarkeesian canceled a talk at Utah State University after receiving a massacre threat inspired by the 1989 Mark Lapine murder of 14 women. Many people, including women of color and trans people, have experienced threats, harassment, and distribution of their location and contact information by people hoping to silence their voices. These violations of privacy and personal safety can morph into physical violence. Our project will develop critical resources to establish and report resilient communities that can limit harm preemptively and respond to harassment effectually when necessary. Resilience is critical to ensuring that digital spaces are available to all. If we are to stop the flight of women from connected work, education, and entertainment, then we must put into place the means to combat out-of-control harassment. Okay, yeah, it's probably just a coincidence, though, that you see Randwell, Harpoon, and Zoe Quinn both coming up with their own anti-harassment organizations. Yeah, probably has nothing to do with this DML Hub contest, which was hosted by Mimi Ito's organization. Yeah. But let's get back to this. I still can't get over the fact that these perverts of the English language now consider tweeting actual violence. Okay, but just for the record, there has never been any violence committed by Gamergate in any fashion. But like I said, these guys make a habit of perverting and distorting the English language. These are the same sick bastards who think racism against white people is impossible. They call it reverse racism, and they say it doesn't exist. Yeah? Well, tell that to my buddy growing up who got put into a coma outside of high school, just standing at the bus stop, and they smashed a garbage can over his head. And then when the community held a meeting about it, the general consensus was that maybe he shouldn't have been in the neighborhood in the first place. Yeah, there's no such thing as reverse racism when children get put in a coma, you sick fucks. I hope your children get rocks thrown at them in elementary school just for being white, just as I did. And then you could sit them down and calmly tell them that they actually deserved it for being white. You people truly have a mental disease. But I digress. Let's get back to this. Here, we have Dana Boyd organizing another panel for the DML 2012 conference, where she was also a speaker. Remember, Macintosh is a member there, and Mimi is the chair. But when we look at the sponsors for the 2012 convention, just like the year before when Macintosh was on the panel, we see that MacArthur and Microsoft Research were the two biggest sponsors. But in 2012, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was a direct sponsor there as well. And also, Karina Wong, who was the lady who we heard in the podcast saying that she's trying as hard as she can, funding all these things to get gaming into education to replace standardized assessment. Well, she was also a plenary panelist there in 2012. So now we have a direct link between the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Macintosh. And for 2013, Dana Boyd, the Microsoft researcher, was not only planning the panels, but she was also a plenary panelist and a keynote speaker. So let's just watch a little clip of the plenary introduction where she was on the panel.
Good morning, everyone.
The energy is awesome.
So we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, just on behalf of the Hub and the MacArthur Foundation, just want to say thank you for your energy, your excitement.
So hi, my name is Dana Boyd, and many of you in this room know me for my research. I have a bunch of different affiliations, but I identify myself as an activist, as an academic, and as an advocate for young people. My associations at this point primarily is Microsoft Research, which is the academic division of Microsoft. I also have a faculty appointment at NYU, and I'm a part of the fellow community at Berkman. But beyond the research that I do really on young people, I've spent a lot of my life trying to figure out how to use different aspects of technology to really organize and connect activists who have been really passionate about changing the world. So for 8 years, I worked for an organization called V-Day, which is known best for the Vagina Monologues, helping build out online communities to connect people. So it's been really fun to watch all of the different possibilities of using new technologies to think about how to make meaningful connections. Because a lot of what I'm really passionate about is bringing together constituencies who do not normally come together, right? We can think about researchers with technologists, with policymakers, with different kinds of activists, with publics. And I know that's a passion for many people in the room.
But when we look at DML 2014, Not only was the Gates Foundation's Karina Wong a plenary panelist once again, but they had a man named Scott Osterweil on a panel which was specifically about gamification. Now, he's the head honcho at the Learning Games Network, which received $3.5 million from Gates since 2011. And along with Mimi Ito, he was commissioned to write a response for the Academy's 2011 report on gamification. His response paper has some interesting content. It reads, "It is worthwhile here to step back and make an analogy between games and films. At one time, the Hollywood studios produced the whole gamut of movies, from big-budget spectaculars to B-movies to thoughtful small films with niche audiences. Over time, the economics of film distribution had driven the studios towards making mostly big-budget films that recycle familiar franchises and storylines. The marketing of these films is expensive. The goal is to make the opening weekend an event on thousands of screens nationwide, enabling the studio to break even quickly, regardless of the film's actual quality. The strategy is high risk, high reward. Each film represents a big investment, and though many will fail, the successes are profitable enough to make up for the failures. As Hollywood has abandoned small, thoughtful films, their production has been taken up by independent producers who don't expect to recap their investment so quickly, but rather hope for word of mouth to fuel prolonged distribution on a smaller number of screens. Compared to the studio's output, these films are relatively low risk and yield smaller rewards in the aggregate, but they contribute greatly to the variety and quality of films in the marketplace. Nowadays, games are subject to similar economies. The best publicized AAA games tend to be glossy retreads of familiar franchises. Upon release, such games have several weeks to recoup their investment in retail outlets or find themselves consigned to the remainders bin, and accordingly they require marketing budgets equal to their development costs. As with films, in response to these market conditions, there is now a burgeoning independent games movement with different aesthetics and different economics. One critical difference is that while big budget games are still sold in shrink wrap through retail outlets, independent games tend to be distributed online, an environment much more conducive to targeted marketing and niche sales. These games are significantly smaller than traditional big budget games. A game can be produced by a handful of dedicated designers, programmers, and artists in a fraction of the time. If the rewards are low to individual producers, the risks are even lower, and the rewards to the larger games field have been enormous. Independent games are proliferating from a staggering array of sources, including industry professionals working in their spare time, dedicated amateurs pursuing their passion, and students experimenting as a part of their course's study. I take the trouble to paint this picture because it suggests something about the difference between centralized development by a narrow group of industry leaders and more widely distributed production from myriad small developers pursuing individual goals. This is a distinction unmade in Mayo's article, and if you remember, Mayo was the woman who gave the speech to Microsoft Research in 2007, saying that gamification of education was vital to national security. It goes on. Indeed, a number of her proposals seem to presume the more centralized big-budget development models. To date, government agencies and foundations have tended to place large bets on a small number of universities and research and development firms, who in turn make big games. I have benefited from some of these funding opportunities, and a handful of such projects have been worthwhile, but overall it has proved to be a high-risk, low-reward strategy. Well, Mayo's suggestions for more rigorous review of business plans by funding agencies and the creation of expert panels that could set industry standards and rate games for pedagogical values would no doubt improve upon the current state of affairs. They tend to do so in the same top-down way that most current game funding decisions are made. Let me repeat that again.
And the creation of expert panels that could set industry standards and rate games for pedagogical values would no doubt improve the current state of affairs.
And this was originally said by the woman who gave a speech about gamification and education to Microsoft Research in 2007, and repeated by the guy who got $3.5 million in grants from Bill Gates over the last few years. And this is why we've seen that all of the indie game contests are rigged, and why you see them putting people like Anita Sarkeesian on the list of judges. It's all part of the plan, and they've been working on it since at least 2010. So this guy just admitted in his own paper that they want to create these panels and place their own people on them to push their agenda. And then guess what happens over the next couple years? Exactly that.
Big coincidence.
And then this guy proceeds to basically lay out the plans for the Ouya, which was actually the second prong of the attack, which I ambiguously mentioned earlier in this presentation. It reads, though web-based distribution does not solve all problems, it does remove the very retail pressures that have caused game publishers to behave more and more like Hollywood studios. Web delivery makes possible free downloadable demos or incremental purchases. Such a commercial model favors the independent developer who can't spend huge subs on advertising to create demand for the product. Then he goes on to say, parties interested in this conversation, government agencies, foundations, universities, and not-for-profits might find it useful to put more of their efforts into helping create the market conditions that would enable such developments in the learning game space. These efforts can include 1. Funding platforms that would function like the iPhone applet store for streaming games. Such platforms would not only house games, but teacher materials as well. They would also host social networks of teachers sharing their practices with each other. 2. Develop microfunding schemes that would provide incentives for small-scale independent developers to undertake learning games while not committing large amounts to any one game or initiative. 3. Help independent developers connect with learning specialists to facilitate the creation of good teacher materials keyed to games. 4. Providing funds to help market promising games that have been developed independently. 5. Continue to support research that demonstrates the effectiveness of game-based learning and helps define emerging best practices. This is an approach that favors experimentation and innovation. As such, it is much more in alignment with a diverse, bottom-up way that changes come to interactive media since the rise of the web. So he listed 5 things that they need to do to spur a new indie game, educational games industry, and just so happens that all 5 of these things were checked off over the next few years. Let me explain. His first step was making an app store for educational games. Well, that was solved by the Ouya. And for step 2, wherein it talked about microfunding specific indie games, well, they just ended up using Kickstarter, and that way they didn't have to fund it themselves, but they could just have journalists pimp the Kickstarters for games that they wanted to succeed, and usually they would get enough money to proceed. For step 3, he talks about helping independent developers connect with learning specialists. That's what the Connected Learning Alliance is. 4, he says, providing funds to help market promising games that have been developed independently. Well, I don't know if actual money changed hands in this instance, but this is why you saw non-stop shilling of some certain indie games. This is exactly what they're trying to do to promote what they saw as promising indie games, but they just did it so blatantly and non-stop that it was just this, like, slapping us in the face. And for step 5, it says continue to support research. Well, of course, that's where you get the MacArthur Foundation's digital learning, the Diagra. I mean, there's a million of those organizations, and they're all getting a lot of funding right now. So as we've seen all 5 of these checked off, and journalists playing an integral role in 2 of those 5, starting to seem like journalists might actually be complicit in this, unless they're just given marching orders.
Big coincidence.
Oh, and there was another guy who gave a presentation to the 2011 Academies Committee. His name is Alex Chisholm, and he works for the Learning Games Network. Learning Games Network received a lot of money and grants from Bill and Melinda Gates. Now, let's go back to that clip from the 2014 DML conference.
Especially for those 3 people who are online watching this on web stream. Welcome to Playing for Keeps. Gameful design for real-world action and social change. My name is Gene Koo. I am an independent consultant who works with organizations on using video games for advancing their social mission.
My name is Scott Osterwald. I'm the creative director of the MIT Education Arcade and of our not-for-profit spin-off, the Learning Games Network. I've made a lot of games over about 20 years. And I hew to a fairly conservative view of games. I sort of go with Eric Zimmerman and Katie Salen. You know, games are a pretty formal thing with a set of goals, clear rules, and kinds of feedback that give you measures of your own success within that game. Having said that, having said that I think when you call something a game, it better be a game. I also think that learning happens in ways that are not, games are only a part of the learning that happens. And so I'm also interested in, the fact that I've given that definition of games doesn't mean that I'm not interested in other things that are close to or similar to games, but not games. So there's reasons to call the game a game, but there's also reasons to look at things that aren't games.
And Eric, can I assume that you came up with this panel?
I did come up with this
Okay,
panel.
so maybe when you introduce yourself, you can also tell us what you mean by gameful.
So my name is Eric Gordon, and I am an associate professor at Emerson College and the director of the Engagement Game Lab there at Emerson. And I'm also a fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. And I'm also a fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard, where I study games games that facilitate, motivate, create civic engagements. And finally, to your question about what I meant by gameful, you know, it's a word that is certainly, I didn't make up. It's a word that's been used by all sorts of people, including Jane McGonigal, to talk about a particular approach to the design of playful experiences, essentially. And often it's been used as a way of distinguishing from other kinds of game design within this space, which would be a kind of gamification. So I actually used it as a way to differentiate what I think all of us will be talking about from other discourses of gamification. So all of us here on the panel, I don't want to speak for everybody exactly, but I will say that the commonality is that we're designing games for some sort of purpose, whether that's learning, capacity building, or civic action. There's some purpose outside of the system of the game that we're trying to achieve. We're trying to reach some goal. We're trying to reach. So, for instance, in the games that I design and in our lab, we're looking at games that, again, motivate some kind of civic learning and subsequently civic action. So some understanding of the sort of public context in which people act, and then some actual understanding or even facilitation of those actions outside. And so what's interesting about that is that these are two parallel and sometimes conflicting goals. We have the goals of the game, and we have the goals outside of the game. When we design a game that is supposed to achieve a purpose outside of that, then we have a bit of a conflict between what Suits calls the pre-illusory goal and what I'll call for a second the extra-illusory goal. What is that goal outside of the game? So there is the goal of the player, when the player, either before the player enters into the game or while the player is in the game, and then there are these other goals, these learning goals, these civic goals, these action-taking goals that we want to achieve. And I see that as a really interesting kind of tension space. So here's the unique challenge. We want to make a player experience. We want the player to experience what is outside the game, even take action outside the game, but we need for the player to voluntarily play the game for an entirely different reason. So there's the challenge. So what does that mean for the context of game design? And it's very, very different, I want to say, than designing other kinds of activities or other kinds of processes. So too often, I think, and this is something I hope we could talk about, organizations seeking to use games resort to gamification as a means of motivating very specific and predefined behaviors. So this is what I was saying before about even the definition of this panel, is I really want to get at that distinction, is that often gamification is about adding game mechanics in order to enhance or make more efficient certain behaviors. But it's not necessarily doing what I was just talking about, which is creating the conditions for play that often lead to very different kinds of learning outcomes. But this game was a game that we launched, or about to launch rather, in the Republic of Moldova, which is a small country next to Ukraine. And the game is about, we were asked to do this game in partnership with the United Nations Development Program, specifically to get at the policy issue of youth unemployment. So we're about to launch this game that is geared towards youth across within the country of Moldova. We started the game process by facilitating a 2-day workshop with with youth leaders from throughout the country that came together to actually think about what it means to play with these very serious ideas, but then ultimately to create content that went into the game. Some of the questions I have about a process like this is to what extent, now you think about this is the game that is being sponsored by the UN, where people will hear about this from that entity. So the entity essentially of the UN will market this to people as a thing to play. And the question I have is, to what extent is trust a background to play in something like this, where what people do in the game is actually going to affect policy? Will the lack of trust in the extra-lusory outcomes, basically, determine willingness to play? So there is absolutely no trust in government. And that's very similar to, well, I would say it's similar but very different to the context in the United States, and we could talk a bit more about that if we have time. So again, the game is sponsored in this case by the UN and not the government, and it was a very explicit decision to not have the government on it at all because of that level of mistrust. Is the dimension of trust that relates to the sponsoring organization's trust in a game. So to what extent is the fact that the UN is sponsoring a game to be played to facilitate feedback on particular policy issues, to what extent does that actually indicate a trust in the illusory goals of the game, a trust in the sense that people will, a trust in that people will play towards, or rather play with a system as opposed to playing towards. They're not just seeking the extra illusory goals, they're actually looking for something else. I don't know that they know what they're looking for, but I think that's an interesting tension. So it's not simply about masking true intent in this case. It's in fact shifting intent. So shifting intent of the sponsoring organization and the players to accommodate play.
So anyway, I want to talk about, we talk about games for learning. I don't think we often really interrogate what we mean by learning, and that's sort of what I want to talk about. What you discover when you sort of dig underneath the hood is that people's model of learning is there's something in my brain and I tell it, and then it's in your brain and you've learned it. And that's a faulty model, of course, and it gets propagated in games in which people think of games as carriers of content. So I filled this game up with content, you play the game, now the content moves into your brain. That's not how it works. We all learn by constructing knowledge, and what games really do are give us tools with which to construct knowledge. One thing that games are really good for is preparation for future learning. What I would argue is that frequently games give us a chance to play with concepts, with ideas, to slowly build up mental models, what I'd like to think of as scaffolding, so that when we actually do engage with real content, that instead of that content sort of going right by us, we start hooking it up. We start wiring it in our brain in our own individual ways because we have the scaffolding, and the game is what provides the scaffolding. Our goal there was the same efficacy goal, was to improve, get their sense that the kinds of things that they do as game players also is what scientists do, to change their sort of identity with science, to get them to realize that they could be scientists. And we did see that result. We did see that result. But there was another thing that we did, and this is the third point I wanted to make, which is that, and this is why, although I started with a very conservative definition of games, this really wasn't a game in the end. It didn't have all the formal features of a game. It had a really engrossing narrative, and they projected themselves into that narrative. And so, so it seems to me that the third thing that games and game-like things can do, and as I said, I don't think things have to all be games, is really invite a kind of imaginative projection into a space to change people's imagination about what's possible. And in that process, to change their sense of what action is possible. And so I think that particularly when we're talking about games for social good, getting people to imagine that there are solutions, to actually maybe use, and this is really coming back to what I think both of you are doing, is to imaginatively project themselves into a problem-solving space. And then those are totally illusory goals, but of course then, like Eric, I have the hope that they become extra illusory goals. There's plenty of research that shows that on sort of the relatively standard measures of learning, that game-like learning can work. I mean, there's a growing body of evidence. I'm hoping we're going to be adding to that body of evidence. But as I said, you can only have that if you're having a productive conversation about learning in general, not just about schools as an institution that produce test scores.
Well, I suppose it's about how you understand the problem to be solved. So,
Right.
what you're saying is that these large agencies have units within them who have intractable problems, and they come to you and they say, "I've got this problem, I need it solved." And the games that you design are very good at solving that. I think in the case of teachers, often it's the problem is, maybe the problem is test scores. Maybe the problem is it's. And if that's the problem, then the solution that gets designed is not necessarily the game that you want to make. And so I guess the issue is then, how can games actually reframe the problem instead of just arriving at solutions more efficiently? No, it happens all the time. And in fact, I think that this question of the authenticity and the legitimacy of play is really what it comes to. And I think one of the design principles that we use in the design of many of our games is a kind of intergenerational component, that when games are only for kids, then play becomes only for kids. And the outcomes of that play then are delegitimized in the eyes of adults because it's simply play. And so I'm really interested in that intergenerational piece, because what it does, and we've done some research about this specifically, but what it does is that it generates a kind of authenticity going both ways. So the youth often see it as authentic, but with the presence of adults within an online system lends a sense of legitimacy to the process for those youth. And likewise, the sense of presence of the youth for the adults lends a sense of hope, actually, as it turns out. And so what's interesting is that when you have those two pieces together, you're actually deflating some of those criticisms of it being only play. So that's one answer. And then the other answer is in dealing with governments and organizations that I deal with a lot. There's often a resistance to that. There's often a resistance to, there's two things. One, on one hand, there's a game, it's so innovative, let's do it, and maybe a misunderstanding of what the actual goals of that is, or rather particular understandings that don't necessarily align with mine. And then on the other hand, there's that disbelief or that mistrust that somehow a game can be fun and not frivolous, and that we're going to delegitimize a process by making it a game. And I actually think that's a fundamental challenge, and it was what I was trying to get at in my earlier comments, is that when we give ourselves to permission to play within this magic circle, are we saying that those actions that are taken within play are not as real or as important as actions that we can take outside of that realm of play? And sure, it's safe, because when we play, we can fail, and it's safe. But at the same time, what I'm really interested in is sort of moving the meter a little bit, so that those acts of play can generate a new form of legitimacy, essentially. That in fact people say, like, oh yeah, people are playing, and in fact we're getting better answers because people are doing it within the context of play.
Could any of you elaborate more or make more explicit the tension between using games to instigate individual behavioral change versus changing institutional cultures? Because I see this list of organizations, and a lot of them do bad things. And yet most of the examples put the impetus for change on the communities. So the example of the payday loan game, don't use payday loan, don't use credit cards. Well, how does that then transform into shut those things down through gaming?
Both are important, and the same foundation that funds that work does other work sort of in the public sphere to try to change policy on that front. But let me shift it to schooling, for example. There's a lot of problems with the education system that I sometimes wish we could just blow it up and start all over again. But then I keep reminding myself, every year there's millions of kids graduating in the system, and so working with the kids who are there now is also important. So I think in that example you gave, yes, it's important to change the system, but there are also people every day who are getting sucked into bad deals, and it's worth trying to speak to them too. It doesn't mean that they're morally responsible for that. I'm not suggesting that the people who take out bad loans are morally responsible for their entrapment. They're not. All the more reason to protect, because society is at large sometimes holds people accountable for those decisions, all the more reason to help them avoid those decisions, not because we share that sensibility. I think there would be different games for different, so a game that was meant to inspire political action would be planned for a different venue, would be a different game than a game that was meant to be about individual responsibility. Both of them have their place.
And just quickly to respond to that, I mean, one of the things that we look at and actually try to measure in some ways is collective efficacy, but I would say that there definitely is a kind of liberal, not radical bent to many of our projects, because we're trying to create efficacy essentially within systems as opposed to trying to operate outside of them. And I think that's just with our games, allowing people to collectively assemble to get something done through the game, even in cooperation with government, is something that we see of value. So while we're not necessarily radically transforming systems that are instilled with problematic sort of power elements, we are actually empowering people to work within those systems in ways that I think are valuable.
Oh, so this Eric Gordon guy is on the Berkman Internet Society, which is a policy advisor to the government. Look at this article that he wrote. It's explicitly about how to use games for political propaganda, which, as we've seen, the Defense Intelligence Agency is extremely interested in. And speaking of the Berkman Internet Society, another member is David Weinberger. Now, he says he was in charge of Howard Dean's 2004 Internet campaign. Huh, you know who else was an advisor to Howard Dean's 2004 Internet campaign? Those two Vox founders, the Polygon founders, that we saw give a speech to Microsoft Research in 2007 talking expressly about that.
Big coincidence.
Just more strange coincidences here. It's weird. So we have Eric Gordon, an admitted propagandist, Dana Boyd, Jimmy Wales, Mimi Ito's brother, Jessica Valenti, and the head of Howard Dean's Internet campaign, among others, all on Harvard Law School's Berkman Internet Society, which is meant to advise lawmakers. A bunch of political radicals trying to dictate internet policy is exactly what I've always wanted. So this Eric Gordon guy talks specifically about how he uses games to incite civic action, which is exactly what the 2010 Academy's report meant when it spoke about using overt propaganda to galvanize action. Notice that this guy who openly admits he loves using games for propaganda and tries to encourage others to do so works directly with Dana Boyd on the Berkman Internet Society. Oh, and Eric Gordon, the game propagandist that we're talking about, was also a member of the DML 2014 Planning Committee. That the DML has someone whose sole intention is literally to propagandize games for indoctrination purposes on their planning committee should be telling.
The biggest coincidence
And when we look into it, it turns that Eric Gordon was actually the one who planned the whole gamification event for DML 2012. He was literally the chair of the track. It seems like a propagandist is taking charge of the games division at DML. Nice. You know, the only thing that's surprising about that is that they're so open about it. But now let's switch tracks and have a good laugh. Let's look at this article on Haztech, where a games scholar is furiously asking why none of the academics involved in games research want to talk about Gamergate. It reads, "The first thing I wanted to deal with in the commentaries was Gamergate. It seemed at the time like most of game studies is tragically avoiding engaging with Gamergate, either by writing the whole thing off as silly and not worth talking about, or by saying that these issues are outside of the domain of game studies. I am not personally on the game studies listserv, but one of my friends told me that Gamergate wasn't even brought up until just this week. This makes me so incredibly angry. What good are game studies academics if we can't stand up for, defend, or at the very least, discuss the safety of those doing game studies and those making games as a profession? Anita Sarkeesian is a game scholar no different than us, other than her incredible fame and tangible effect on the world that most of us could never strive to reach. So why aren't other game scholars standing up for her? Okay, first of all, Anita Sarkeesian is not a scholar by any stretch of the imagination. She just stands up there and makes unfounded claims for the purpose of propaganda that's not backed up by any research and is actually directly refuted by Macintosh's own boss, but ignoring that. The real reason why you don't see games scholars talking about it is because they don't want to draw attention back on themselves and get caught, which ended up happening anyway. This poor sap that wrote the article was just out of the loop. Want to see something else funny? On Anita Sarkeesian's own wiki, it actually references a MacArthur Spotlight article about Anita's harassment as proof that it happened. Notice in the article that there's no disclosure at all that the writer and producer for Anita's nonprofit is actually an employee of MacArthur. But see, that was before Gamergate broke out. Once Gamergate broke out, you didn't see MacArthur Foundation talking about Gamergate at all. Well, you saw the DML Hub's competition, but that was an internal thing. So the MacArthur News Wing had written about Sarkeesian a couple times before Gamergate broke out, but then they shut up once it did because they didn't want to get caught. But let's get back to the MacArthur Foundation and the relationship with Bill Gates. We've already seen that the Gates Foundation head of education, Karina Wong, was a plenary speaker at the MacArthur Foundation's DML conference in 2012. And we also know that the Gates Foundation directly sponsored the event in 2012, but the relationship goes far deeper than that. See, Wong was also a plenary panel member in 2014. So let's watch a clip of her speech.
And I just want to take a second to acknowledge people. First, the MacArthur Foundation, who provided funding for this work, but also MacArthur Foundation convened a group of folks in November in Chicago, and all of us learned a lot from that group of people that's informed our thinking in this work. And the last thing I want to say is that there is a paper from which this is drawn that is very long and very detailed. And if you'd like a copy of that, just send me an email and I'm happy to share it with you.
And then I said, oh yeah, I'm going to this conference tomorrow. You know, it's something, I was kind of explaining it kind of slowly, like something around digital media and learning. And she said, oh, DML, the Learning Labs? I'm going to be on a panel tomorrow morning. And my mouth dropped and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm just the breakout room. My niece is taking center stage here. My husband works in political communications and he always talks about like, you're below the fold, honey. So I feel like I'm a little below the fold here and it's quite a privilege. If you have any doubt that the young people today are gonna take over the world, do you want to put that back in? They are certainly gonna take over the world.
And I also want to thank my friend Karina. This conference is about connecting practices, and I was on a panel yesterday and talked a little bit about in building networks and in connecting practices, how incredibly important it is to build trust, and how incredibly important in building that trust that then enables having productive friction, because it's really when you're having that productive friction that new ideas and innovation can happen. And as you can imagine, there's often productive friction in conversations between MacArthur and Gates. And Karina and I have really built, I think, a lot of trust and had a ton of wonderful conversations. And I think we have to be building bridges between our separate and different, but sometimes overlapping communities. And Karina took a red eye just to be here for today's conference. And I just really want to thank you for participating in our community, for being here, and being willing to withstand my productive friction. I really appreciate it.
If we have a certain platform and a visibility that maybe not everybody has, but a lot of the things that we are celebrating and promoting as connected learning, or the kinds of youth practices that I've found, are not things that I've created or designed, but things that I've discovered by listening attentively to what young people are doing. And so in sort of trying to reconcile that with the idea of spreading our innovations, which is often the frame that we put on this, there's something that's not quite clicking for me there, and is a very practical struggle as we move into the next phase of work on how we think about it. So the question I want to put forward is, what if we, so Cynthia has these arrows going in this direction, then there's these green contexts, right? So what if we rethink our goal as not spreading our innovations, but of changing context so that people can take up the innovations that are already there? Because there is sort of, and this is a belief system, it's not something that I've researched, but I kind of believe that if people had the ability and the context that would enable them to take up innovative practices in relation to new technology, that they would do it, that maybe it's the context that are inhibiting the uptake and not our need to message and push and professionally develop and all the things that we tend to think of in our spread and scale strategies. And I think the reality is that it's both things have to happen. But I kind of want to put it on the table to see if people have done thinking about that, if that's sort of a, again, this division of labor, a set of interlinked alliances that we can think of that are equally important in how we consider what spread actually means.
Mimi, can I just ask you a quick question since you're standing there? Because part of what I was thinking about as Cynthia was presenting was also that I've been thinking about it not so much as spread and scale, but how do we make sure that everybody participates? Mm-hmm. And what does that look like? And I don't know if that is akin to what if I'm on the same page as you are, or if you're thinking about something slightly different.
Yeah, so I think it is trying to understand the conditions of why people aren't already participating. Mm-hmm. What are the conditions, which is, the same thing that I ask about young people, because, we're in an era of abundant opportunity with learning, and there's only certain young people who are taking it up. But it's not for lack of cool stuff. The problem is not the cool stuff. The problem is the fact that people aren't taking it up for whatever reason.
So the Gates Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation are the two biggest revolutionaries in education today. They both share many of the same goals and fund many of the same endeavors. As we've seen, Microsoft works literally hand in hand with MacArthur Digital Learning as well, through Dana Boyd. But one of the things Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation have in common is that they both fund the Brookings Institution. Of course, Gates Foundation gave a hell of a lot more, as Gates is a top contributor, period. But it goes to show that they are working towards the same exact agenda, albeit for different reasons. See, MacArthur wants to change the gaming landscape because they think it will change society politically. They think that it'll make society progress from a perspective of critical theory anyway, which, as we know, Macintosh is a devout follower of. Now, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation pretends to be altruistic, but in reality, their motives are ulterior. Simply put, Gates, Microsoft, other tech companies, and venture capitalists stand to make billions off the gamification of education. And of course, the first step for clearing the way for gamification in education was passing the Common Core State Standards Initiative in pretty much all major states, as we've already seen done. Now, Gates might spend $5 billion on education reform, which is what's claimed, but he stands to make many times more than that in profits if his plan comes to fruition.
Well, congratulations! You got yourself caught! Sir, now what's the next step of your master plan?
Speaking of getting caught, let's touch back on the Brookings Institution, which I just mentioned. The New York Times was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for September 2014 article titled "Foreign Powers Buy Influence at Think Tanks," where it specifically mentioned the Brookings Institution as being complicit in corruption. Essentially, the Brookings Institution is nothing but a mouthpiece for multinational and governmental interests, which tries to pass itself off as a respected educational institution that can get major press coverage anytime it holds a conference. But crooked institutions tend to have their hands in a lot of garbage pails. And it should be no surprise that a Slashdot submission caught the Brookings Institution red-handed, hyping a fabricated crisis. The article is titled "Think Tanks: How a Bill Gates Agenda Becomes a Law." It reads, "The New York Times' Eric Lipton was just awarded a 2015 Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting that shed light on how foreign powers buy influence at think tanks, so it probably bears mentioning that Microsoft's two-pronged national talent strategy to increase K-12 computer science education and the number of H-1B visas, which is on the verge of being codified into laws, was hatched at an influential Microsoft and Gates Foundation-backed think tank mentioned in Lipton's reporting, the Brookings Institution. In 2012, the Center for Technology Innovation at Brookings hosted a forum on STEM education and immigration reforms, where fabricating a crisis was discussed as a strategy to succeed with Microsoft's agenda after early lobbying attempts by Bill Gates and Microsoft had failed. So Microsoft General Counsel Brad Smith, asked the Brookings Institution's Darrell West at the event, So you're the only one who mentioned this topic of making the problem bigger, so we galvanize action by really producing a crisis, I take it? Yeah, Smith replied. And with the help of nonprofit organizations like Code.org and FWD.US that were founded shortly thereafter, a national K-12 computer science and tech immigration crisis was indeed created. And after knowing everything that has been revealed in this presentation thus far, that Microsoft absolutely knew since 2010 that gaming culture had to be changed if they wanted to open the door to new multi-billion-dollar monopoly status government education contracts, as well as totally new demographics which would generate astronomical profits. It should be no surprise that we see the same formula applied as the Brookings Institution used to push the fabricated H-1B crisis. The steps are: 1. Initial lobbying efforts fail. 2. Think tank fabricates a crisis to exploit in order to change the public's opinion. 3. Non-profits arise used solely to throw a fit about the fake crisis at hand. 4. The corrupt media reports on the non-profits' conniption fits and turns the fake crisis into a media frenzy. 5. The public gets scared into submission and falls to the whims of their master. Now, with the H-1B agenda, that's exactly what happened, all 5 of those steps, and now the law is about to be passed. But with Gamergate, they only got steps 1 through 4. Let's go over them. Well, originally we saw the Serious Games Initiative, which was backed and even led by Microsoft, completely and utterly fail after a few years. It started in 2002, and we saw Ben Sawyer do a presentation to Microsoft about it in 2007, where he seemed enthusiastic, but within a couple of years the initiative was dead in the water, and now the website has vanished off the face of the internet. And don't get it twisted, the Serious Games Initiative was a true lobbying effort. So their initial lobbying efforts failed. That's step 1. So then for step 2, the Brookings Institution, knowing all the problems and uptake of serious games that were mentioned by these reports, came up with their plan on how to solve it. So that was step 2. Then for step 3, we saw brand new nonprofits arise pushing a bullshit fabricated crisis. I wonder who was involved in that step.
Nice tinfoil hat, dummy. It's just a big coincidence.
And then for step 4, you saw the corrupt news organizations falling over themselves to report on Feminist Frequency's fake crisis, whipping it up into a media tirade. And then it's no coincidence, we have that undisputable video evidence of Polygon teaching Microsoft about the wonders of internet propaganda in 2006, but then in 2012, they open a website which spews nothing but blatant propaganda, and then right when they opened, they received $750,000 from Microsoft to make a documentary about themselves.
Did you forget to take your medication? It's all a big coincidence.
So they had steps 1 through 4 down pat, but when it came to step 5, the public getting scared into submission, well, they failed miserably. Even though we couldn't see the true story for what it was, we knew something smelled rank. The Brookings boys, who had hatched both the Guerrilla Gaming Reform Plan and the Guerrilla H-1B Reform Plan at the same time, never would have guessed that the Games Journal Pro List would have been leaked. And they definitely thought that nobody would take the time or energy to put all the pieces of the puzzle together. They didn't count on me,
what if you could
but
push
here
a
we
button
are.
and reset the entire video game industry?
But let's go back to the H-1B scandal. It's interesting to note that the non-profit which the Brookings Institution used to push the H-1B crisis was actually started by Zuckerberg and then led by John Doerr of Kleiner & Perkins, which is the country's most successful venture capital firm. Kleiner Perkins also heavily promoted the fabricated crisis on their own dime with propaganda packets designed to get other tech companies involved. You see, when big tech companies share interests, they have a miraculous ability to put aside differences and work in tandem. The true intention of the H-1B crisis was to cheapen the labor pool. Now, to see how truly heartless this was and how detrimental to American society this H-1B reform is, well, check out this other article I got from Slashdot recently, which shows that FWD.US, which was led by Zuckerberg and John Doerr, tells 500 employees who were forced to train their foreign replacements that they were unqualified for the job, and basically tells them to go cry themselves a river. Okay, answer me this, guys. If they were unqualified, then why did you have them train the new employees?
Correct.
We know it's actually all about tech companies getting cheap labor, foreign labor, and the increased price of $10,000 to import someone is nothing but a drop in the bucket compared to what the tech companies can save. So it's no coincidence that we also see John Doerr trying to spur a tech revolution in education in the guise of philanthropy. Of course, his true intentions are to make billions of dollars for him and his buddies as they get in on the ground floor of the new revolution. This is why John Doerr had his wife give a massive donation to the Khan Academy at a time when they were pretty much living off of scraps. Lo and behold, soon after Anne got Khan Academy off the ground, she introduced Khan to Gates personally. And guess who then took over as the biggest contributor? Yeah, so both Doerr and Microsoft stand to make insane amounts of money if more universities switch to a MOOC interface. Like always, it's all about the Benjamins. Here's a little clip from a Kleiner and Perkins podcast about the future of education technology.
Hi, and welcome to the KPCB podcast. My name is John Doerr, a partner at Kleiner Perkins, Caulfield & Byers. And as part of the KPCB Leadership Salon series, I hosted a panel of education technology innovators to discuss how technology has and will continue to fundamentally change the way we approach education, both in the United States and abroad. It was a really great panel. The panelists included Daphne Kohler, co-founder and president of Coursera, and a professor in the Stanford School of Engineering; Brett Kopf, the co-founder and CEO of Remind 101, and Dan Rosenzweig, president and CEO of Chegg. And so Daphne, will you tell us a bit about the milestones that Coursera has achieved?
So Coursera started out as a Stanford University effort back in September 2011, where we were the first to offer what are now called MOOCs, Massive Open Online Courses. There were 3 of them that were offered. They each had an enrollment of 100,000 students or more, and it really, I think, presented an opportunity that my co-founder Andrea and I couldn't pass up in offering an amazing education that had been available only to a tiny handful of people to everyone around the world for free. So with the generous support of Kleiner Perkins and NEA, we launched this as a separate effort in January of 2012 so that we could work not just with Stanford courses but with multiple top universities. We launched in April of 2012, and at that point we had 4 university partners, Princeton, Stanford, Penn, and Michigan. We had 37 courses and 200,000 legacy students left over from the Stanford courses in the fall of 2011. And 2 years later, we have 7.3 million students from every country around the world. We have 450 courses or thereabouts from 108 university partners, offered natively in 8 different languages. That doesn't include the translated subtitles. And we're offering an education in every discipline for students everywhere to take for free. There is an opportunity here to really transform the world of education by making education a basic human right as opposed to a privilege of a few.
But now let's take a look at the gaming scandal John Doerr was directly involved in. The Ouya. See, think tanks don't think like normal people do. See, normal people make a plan they know will succeed, and if it fails, they sit down and think of something else, and then try again. Think tanks, on the other hand, including those seeking geopolitical domination, always have a contingency plan prepared to start right where the previous plan left off whenever it fails. With that in mind, the Oculus Rift will likely be their next big push for serious games. But let's back it up and talk about that initial lobbying effort, the Serious Games Initiative, which started in 2002. Well, it failed miserably outside of garnering some defense contracts, which, well, are nice. Those projects are relatively low profit and small in scale, and it's nothing compared to educational and consumer money.
So their original plan was actually a two-pronged approach, just as the H-1B in computer science reform was a two-pronged approach. And we've seen feminist frequency was one of those prongs. The other prong was actually the Ouya. And we've seen this in Osterwald's paper, where he laid out those 5 things to check off to push independent, serious games. Now, some of those could be taken care of by journalists, and some of those were taken care of organizations like Diagra. What was left, the Ouya solved. Now, let me also refer back to a quote which I've already read from Mimi's 2008 paper titled Learning Race and Ethnicity. As for who is missing, he adds, nonprofits, foundations, venture capitalists, video game publishers, and the entertainment side of the industry are all missing from the equation. Notice what he said was missing from the serious games equation for success. Nonprofits, foundations, venture capitalists, and video game publishers. Both of these guys, Osterwald and this other guy, identified all the missing pieces of the equation, and it's just a big coincidence that after all the missing pieces of the equation were identified, you see them all solved one by one, popping out of nowhere and falling right into place. The most obvious intention of the Ouya was to enable a new developer landscape where the devs could be free to tell the stories that they wanted to tell and not forced to tell the stories that they were pressured into by some shareholder. The Ouya was to create a game space that was new and unique, a space that could shed all the baggage that was built up by the industry over the years. Remember, as the 2010 National Academies paper stated, Japan and Europe don't have a problem adopting serious games. It's only the North American population that needed to be targeted. It's no surprise that North America saw the hardest shilling of any product we'll probably ever see. There were practically non-stop proclamations about how great the Ouya was going to be and how it was going to change the world. Of course, it didn't, and the Ouya is currently on the brink of bankruptcy, and if they don't find a sucker to buy them soon, they will be totally vanquished. If you're watching this in the future, they're probably already bankrupt, but the Ouya board members knew that the writing was on the wall at least by last summer. They just kept it under wraps. So it was no coincidence that the gamers are dead barrage came as soon as they knew that the Ouya was unsalvageable. But what's interesting here is we have John Doerr, who is basically the one calling the shots at Kleiner and Perkins, taking charge and raising $15 million in venture capital for the Ouya, and then promptly placing the former EA head Gordon Being on the board of directors once the funds were raised. Now, this is the same John Doerr that newspapers said was the leader of Zuckerberg's FWD.US nonprofit, which we know was created to push the fabricated crisis, and the same John Doerr that tries to kickstart an online education revolution so that he can make billions. But now, if the words of the National Institution weren't enough to convince you that Microsoft had long known that they needed to disrupt the gaming status quo if they want serious games to be accepted, well, let's look at Microsoft's introduction to a lecture they did on, quote, blended digital learning in 2014. It states, "The promise of technology and learning has been long in coming. For decades, public perception around technology's potential to revolutionize learning has driven much of the conversation, for better or for worse. However, Microsoft is helping to accelerate this transformation with research-driven tools that will increase access, efficiency, and knowledge around how to best deliver education services." So he explicitly says that public's perception drives the conversation around technology and learning. And for another instance of this knowledge and motive, let's look at the 2010 paper by the head of gaming at Microsoft External Research, that guy who introduced the gamification speakers, John Nordlinger. It reads, "Despite the proven success of using computer video games as a context for teaching introductory programming courses, barriers including the lack of adoptable materials, required background expertise, and institutional acceptance still prevent interested faculty members from experimenting with this approach." So it's clear that the gamer identity had to die if serious games are to take hold in America, which is apparently necessary for institutional acceptance of gaming and education. And also note, this paper was released the same year as the National Academies report, which made similar assertions. And it's also interesting that John Nordlinger has been far more than simply an observer in the field of gamified education since long before 2010. I found a blog mentioning that Nordlinger gave a presentation about gamification in 2007, which I actually had mentioned earlier in this presentation, although I hadn't gone into who Nordlinger was. Now, the video of this presentation is nowhere to be found, but I was able to find a description. It states, the conference will also feature keynote speaker John Nordlinger, program manager for Microsoft Research, who will address the role of games in learning, and Calvin Calaffer, political cartoonist for The Economist. Cal will discuss animated politics, seeing satire come alive in 3D. The welcoming address will be given by Ben Sawyer of the Serious Games Initiative. Notice that it's Ben Sawyer here to welcome everyone. The same Ben Sawyer that we saw give this speech about serious games to Microsoft in 2007, where Nordlinger introduced him. And it's the same Sawyer that we saw on the committee that authored the National Academy's paper on games in 2010, which was commissioned by the Defense Intelligence Agency. So there's obviously a very cozy relationship between the gamification researchers like Ben Sawyer and Microsoft Research. But when we look into Ben Sawyer, we find that he works for Wilson Center. I found a paper by him about serious games there. Now there's some very pertinent analysis which comes out of this paper, so let's dive in. It reads, in the 1996 paper, Opportunities for Collaboration Between Defense and Entertainment Research Communities from the Committee on Modeling and Simulation, a subcommittee of the National Research Council, documented the key barriers to greater cross-industry collaboration. However, while offering a few recommendations to improve the landscape, the panel missed some points entirely due to its high-level composition. Some of the obstacles also identified have been positively affected by structural changes in the industry since 1996. The following is a point-by-point review of the major barriers presented in that paper and how, if applicable, these barriers have since been addressed. So here, he gives reference to a 1996 paper that was included in the 1997 report titled Modeling and Simulation, Linking Entertainment and Defense, that was done by the same Modeling and Simulation Committee at the National Academies that authored the 2010 paper, although it was different members of that committee. And as I've already said, Ben Sawyer, the guy writing this, was actually a member of that 2010 committee. But let's go over his analysis here. He's basically saying that in 1996, the committee found a huge list of problems that were stopping the games industry from moving to modeling and simulations applications. Some of these problems were cost and profit structures, development timeframes and structure, intellectual property rights, and interaction and sharing between communities. But Sawyer says that all of those obstacles which were mentioned in 1996 have been overcome. But then he says that that committee didn't see some of the other problems. So remember, Ben was on that committee that authored the paper in 2010, where it states that the only real major problem to overcome was the cultural attitudes of the North American market. So that 1996 paper never addressed that problem, but focused on the far more immediate problems instead. And it seems like that National Academy's committee agreed with Ben, because the only real obstacle they saw in uptake was the cultural attitudes of the North American market. So us gamers were all that was standing in their way. Now do you see why they had to kill us? And as one final reminder, 2010 was the year of the report, the year Kyle Orland's wife interned at Microsoft Research, and the year Kyle Orland founded the Games Journal Pro List.
Go back to pull, you stupid poopy conspiracy head.
And also remember, it has already been proven that Mr. Sawyer and Microsoft External Research have worked together very closely since at least 2007. So there really should be no doubt at this point that killing gamers was a coordinated assassination attempt. And after everything that's been covered, it should be no surprise that both Gates and WestEd are mentioned by name in a documentary titled Who is Behind the Privatization of Education? Gates, Broad, Kipp, Pearson, WestEd, and the Gulen Schools. Oh, and one last thing. Tell me if this doesn't scare the crap out of you. You have Donald Brinkman saying on his blog, I have been recruited to lead the data connection and analysis efforts at Microsoft within the Educational Products Group. It is a fascinating project, and I am part of an incredible team. But let's look at his resume here. It says, 8 years as a software engineer and technical lead for DARPA, Army/Air Force, and Office of Secretary of Defense research projects. Prior work includes quantum information systems, quantum cryptography, intelligence collection, and adaptive cross-cultural education. So you have a former DARPA military guy who's in charge of intelligence collection, and somebody who's worked on the Secretary of Defense's research projects, and you put this guy in charge of data mining and analyzing our children's learning? Back in that 2010 Academies paper, they listed the uses of serious games like this: A possible classification for the types of non-entertainment outputs and effects from games might break down as follows: learning and skills, biological and physiological health, psychological and behavioral health, communication and organizational behavior, productivity, and advocacy and propaganda. Now, which one of those do you think a spook like Donald Brinkman is interested in? And that report made it painfully clear that games are the perfect carrier for indoctrination, subversion, or even overt propaganda. I'll just leave it at that. But you know who else does work for DARPA? Yup, Ben Sawyer, that guy who started the Serious Games Initiative. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed your daily dose of red pills. So I gotta give a big shout out to everyone that helped me out. You know who you were, and I know who you were, and I will never forget it.
And journalists, hit me up if you want to report on a real story for once. I know you're too lazy and don't have time or energy to do any actual investigation for yourself, but look, I did it all for you with the help of my buddies, and I can help you out if you're trying to write a story or possibly give you an interview. So hit me up on here or on Twitter. And for everyone else who's watching, just putting this on record, I would never commit suicide. So there's more to come, more info, more analysis, more connections, more globalist slang, and more Orland Assert.
Orland Assert. Orland Assert.
So subscribe, stay tuned, and spread this like peanut butter. Peanut butter. Peanut butter. Peanut butter. Peanut butter. Peanut butter.